In the quiet early hours of a New York morning, when the city's noise softened into a distant hum and even the most restless streets paused to breathe, a man sat calmly in a barber's chair. The room was warm, softly lit, almost ordinary. Mirrors reflected a familiar image, a well-dressed middle-aged man, broad-shouldered, confident, his eyes half-closed as if surrendering to routine. For anyone passing by, there was nothing remarkable about the moment. Yet within seconds, the silence would shatter, and with it, the reign of one of the most feared men in American criminal history. Albert Anastasia, a name whispered for decades in fear and awe, was about to become a memory. To understand how such a powerful figure could meet such a sudden end, one must first step back into the shadows that shaped him. Albert Anastasia was not merely a gangster or a crime boss. He was a symbol of raw violence in an era when murder was not just a crime, but a method of governance. His influence stretched quietly across New York, into dockyards, union halls, smoke-filled back rooms, and the darkest corners of organized crime. To many, he was known by a chilling title, the Lord High Executioner. To others, he was simply the man you never crossed, because crossing him often meant disappearing forever. Yet power, especially power built on fear, carries with it an invisible weight. It isolates. It sharpens enemies. It creates a world where trust becomes rare and sleep comes lightly. As the city outside drifted through decades of change, Albert Anastasia rose steadily, violently, carving a reputation that made even hardened criminals uneasy. His story is not one of glamour or clever schemes, but of brute force, impulsive rage, and a belief that fear alone could hold an empire together. In the early 20th century, New York was a city of contrasts. Immigrants arrived daily, chasing hope through crowded ports and narrow streets, while organized crime quietly embedded itself into the fabric of everyday life. For many young men, especially those raised amid poverty and instability, the underworld offered something society did not: belonging, protection, and a twisted sense of purpose. Albert Anastasia would become one of the most extreme products of that world, shaped by hardship, opportunity, and an unsettling comfort with violence. Those who worked alongside him often described a man of contradictions. He could be generous, even warm, rewarding loyalty with money and protection. But that warmth could vanish in an instant, replaced by sudden, explosive anger. Meetings were tense affairs. Words were chosen carefully. A wrong glance, a careless comment, or even silence could provoke a deadly response. Fear followed him like a shadow, not only among his enemies, but among his closest associates as well. As the mafia in America evolved, moving slowly toward structure and restraint, Anastasia remained a relic of a more savage time. While others spoke of rules, commissions, and diplomacy, he believed in action. To him, violence was not a last resort, it was the foundation of authority. This philosophy earned him rapid respect and deep resentment in equal measure. And in the criminal world, resentment rarely stays dormant forever. What makes his story especially haunting is not just the bloodshed or the power, but the inevitability that seems to hang over his life. Like a low, constant drumbeat, consequences gathered quietly in the background. Every act of intimidation, every impulsive killing, every public display of dominance added another name to the list of those who waited patiently for his fall. In a world governed by long memories and silent grudges, patience was often deadlier than rage. Albert Anastasia lived surrounded by luxury in his later years. Fine suits, expensive cars, ocean views, and loyal bodyguards became part of his daily existence. Yet beneath that comfort lay constant unease. He trusted few. He slept lightly. He changed routines. Even the simple act of getting a haircut required caution. And still, despite all his precautions, the end arrived quietly, disguised as routine. This story is not told to glorify violence, nor to awaken fear, but to understand a particular chapter in American history where crime, power, and personality collided in extreme ways. It is a story about how absolute control can breed absolute isolation. About how fear can build empires but rarely sustains them. And about how even the most feared men eventually sit alone with their thoughts, unaware that their time has run out. As we move gently backward through the years, away from that barbershop and into the darker corridors of the past, we will trace the path that led Albert Anastasia from a troubled beginning to the peak of underworld power. We will explore the forces that shaped him, the alliances that elevated him, and the enemies who quietly watched and waited. Piece by piece, the myth will soften into a man, and the man will dissolve back into myth. For now, imagine the city outside that barbershop. Traffic passing by, footsteps echoing on pavement, lives unfolding without pause. Inside, a man closes his eyes, unaware that his name will soon pass from whispered fear into historical reflection. In that moment of calm, before the noise returns, we begin the story of Albert Anastasia, murderer, ruler, and a reminder that power built on terror always carries the sound of its own ending. Long before his name carried fear through the streets of New York, before whispers followed him into rooms and silence fell when he spoke, Albert Anastasia began life far from America, in a land where hardship was ordinary and violence was woven quietly into daily existence. He was born Umberto Anastasio in 1902 in Tropea, a small coastal town in the southern Italian region of Calabria. The landscape was beautiful in a distant, almost cruel way, sunlit hills, olive groves, and the endless blue of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Yet beneath this natural calm lay generations of poverty, instability, and unspoken rules that shaped young minds early. Calabria at the turn of the century was a place where survival came before dreams. Families lived close together, bound by blood, tradition, and necessity. Work was scarce, education limited, and authority often came not from the state but from those who could enforce their will. In such an environment, children learned quickly who held power and how easily it could be taken away. Respect was not requested, it was demanded, often through intimidation or force. This was the world that formed Umberto's earliest understanding of strength. Very little is recorded about his childhood in precise detail, and that absence itself speaks volumes. In southern Italy, especially among the poor, lives passed without documentation, without ceremony. What is known is that his family struggled, like so many others. His father died when Umberto was young, leaving the household unstable and vulnerable. The loss removed not only emotional security but also protection in a society where male authority mattered deeply. For a young boy, this absence could shape instincts in quiet but permanent ways. Violence in Calabria was not always loud. It was often subtle, implied, carried in looks and reputations. Feuds could last generations. Vengeance was spoken of in hushed tones, accepted as inevitable rather than questioned. Children absorbed these lessons not through lectures but through observation. They learned when to speak, when to stay silent, and how fear traveled faster than truth. For Umberto, these lessons would become second nature. As he grew older, restlessness took hold. Like many young men of his time, he looked beyond his village toward the idea of escape. America loomed large in the imagination of southern Italians, a distant land of opportunity, money, and reinvention. Stories traveled back across the ocean, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes false, but always powerful. They spoke of streets where fortunes could be made and identities could be reshaped. For someone with little to lose, the promise was irresistible. By his teenage years, Umberto had already begun to drift toward trouble. Authority did not impress him. Discipline felt optional. Survival instincts hardened into defiance. When opportunity arose, he left Italy under circumstances that remain murky, reportedly stowing away on a ship bound for the United States. This act alone revealed key traits that would define his life: risk-taking, impatience, and a willingness to defy rules when they stood in his way. The journey across the Atlantic was harsh, uncomfortable, and uncertain. Stowaways lived hidden, hungry, and afraid of discovery. But for Umberto, the discomfort was temporary. The destination mattered more than the cost. By the time he reached American shores, he was no longer a village boy from Calabria. He was a young man shaped by loss, hunger, and a growing belief that strength came from dominance. Ellis Island processed millions of immigrants, each carrying hope and fear in equal measure. For Umberto Anastasio, America did not greet him with warmth. He entered a world that was loud, crowded, and unforgiving. Language barriers isolated him. Prejudice limited opportunities. Italian immigrants clustered together in neighborhoods where familiarity offered protection, but also where crime thrived in the absence of social mobility. Brooklyn became his new home, a place where tenements rose tightly together and the streets never truly slept. Here, young men competed fiercely for respect. Physical strength mattered. Reputation mattered. Fear mattered. Legitimate work was exhausting and poorly paid, while crime offered quicker rewards and instant recognition. For someone already comfortable with risk and confrontation, the choice was almost natural. Umberto's transition into criminal behavior was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, shaped by environment and necessity. Petty crimes came first, followed by bolder acts. Arrests were frequent, but consequences were limited. In a strange way, early encounters with the law reinforced his belief that authority was weak, something to be tested rather than feared. Each escape from serious punishment added to his confidence. What truly distinguished him from others was not ambition alone, but temperament. He possessed a volatile edge, an unpredictability that made people cautious around him. Anger came quickly. Violence followed easily. Yet he also understood loyalty and expected it absolutely. These traits made him dangerous, but also valuable in the emerging world of organized crime, where enforcers were always in demand. As Umberto became Albert, adapting his name to fit his new environment, he left behind whatever innocence childhood might have held. The lessons of Calabria, silence, retaliation, respect through fear, merged seamlessly with the brutal realities of American street life. His identity solidified in the spaces where survival met opportunity, where fear became influence. By the time he entered adulthood, the foundation had already been laid. He was no longer searching for direction. He had found it. Violence was not a reaction, it was a tool. Fear was not a consequence, it was a strategy. And the quiet boy from southern Italy had transformed into a figure who would soon step fully into the shadows of America's criminal underworld, carrying with him the echoes of a childhood shaped by loss, hardship, and the early understanding that power belonged to those willing to take it. When Albert Anastasia fully stepped into life in America, the streets of New York did not offer welcome or guidance. They offered noise, hunger, competition, and opportunity in equal measure. Brooklyn in the early 1920s was crowded with immigrants who spoke dozens of languages but shared the same daily struggle. Tenement buildings rose close together, their narrow hallways filled with echoes of arguments, laughter, and exhaustion. For a young man with little education, limited English, and no powerful connections, survival demanded quick adaptation. Anastasia gravitated naturally toward the waterfront. The docks were chaotic, dangerous places where longshoremen unloaded cargo through the night, and where strength and intimidation mattered more than paperwork. Work was irregular, unions were corrupt or controlled by muscle, and criminal organizations quietly dictated who worked and who didn't. Violence on the docks was not exceptional, it was expected. Fights broke out over wages, positions, and loyalty. For Anastasia, this environment felt familiar. It mirrored the unspoken rules he had learned as a child, where power was enforced physically and reputation traveled faster than explanation. He began associating with other Italian and Jewish criminals who operated along the waterfront. These early relationships were practical rather than emotional. Trust was limited. Loyalty was transactional. Yet Anastasia quickly earned a reputation as someone who could be relied upon when intimidation or violence was required. He did not hesitate. He did not negotiate when force would suffice. This made him useful, and in the criminal world, usefulness was the first step toward survival. His criminal record grew steadily. Assault, weapons charges, and other violent offenses brought him to the attention of police, but rarely resulted in long sentences. Witnesses disappeared. Testimony changed. Cases fell apart. Each brush with the law reinforced Anastasia's sense of invincibility. He learned early that fear extended beyond the streets and into courtrooms, shaping outcomes without a word being spoken. During this period, he crossed paths with men who would shape the next stage of his life. One of the most significant was Lucky Luciano, a rising figure within the Italian-American mafia who understood that the future of organized crime required structure, cooperation, and a degree of restraint. Luciano recognized in Anastasia something valuable and dangerous, a man perfectly suited for enforcement, but ill-suited for diplomacy. Their relationship was not one of friendship, but of mutual advantage. Anastasia also formed a close bond with Meyer Lansky, a key architect of the modern American crime syndicate. Lansky saw beyond ethnic boundaries and valued efficiency over tradition. To him, Anastasia was a tool, brutal, effective, and loyal when properly managed. Through these associations, Anastasia moved closer to the center of organized crime, transitioning from street-level violence to something far more systematic. The early 1930s marked a turning point. The old mafia structure in America was collapsing under internal wars and public scrutiny. Leaders like Luciano sought to modernize, eliminating chaotic vendettas in favor of coordinated operations. Violence would still exist, but it would be controlled, purposeful. Anastasia, however, represented the raw edge of this world, the necessary brutality that enforced order when words failed. It was during this transformation that Anastasia became deeply involved in what would later be known as Murder, Incorporated. Though the name itself was popularized by journalists, the organization was very real, a loosely organized group of contract killers who carried out executions on behalf of the National Crime Syndicate. Anastasia emerged as one of its central figures, overseeing operations and ensuring that orders were followed without question. His role was not administrative in the traditional sense. He did not draft plans or negotiate contracts. His authority came from presence. When Anastasia entered a room, conversations stopped. Decisions were finalized. He embodied consequence. This reputation did not form overnight, but it solidified quickly. Stories spread of his temper, his unpredictability, and his willingness to kill personally if necessary. Despite his growing power, Anastasia remained a deeply restless figure. He distrusted stability. Routine bored him. While others in the syndicate focused on long-term profits and political insulation, he remained attached to direct action. This created tension beneath the surface, especially with those who valued order over fear. Yet for the moment, his usefulness outweighed his volatility. The waterfront remained his domain. Through intimidation and violence, he helped secure control over dock unions, ensuring that cargo theft, labor manipulation, and smuggling operations ran smoothly. Longshoremen feared him. Union leaders answered to him. The docks became not just a workplace, but a kingdom ruled through whispered warnings and silent compliance. At the same time, Anastasia cultivated an image of loyalty. He supported his allies without hesitation. When orders came from above, they were carried out efficiently. This reliability earned him protection from powerful figures who understood that without men like Anastasia, their authority would mean little. In a strange way, his brutality stabilized the very system that would eventually turn against him. Yet beneath the surface of success, cracks were already forming. Anastasia's reliance on fear alienated potential allies. His impulsive violence threatened the careful balance that leaders like Luciano and Lansky worked to maintain. Each act of unnecessary brutality increased resentment, even among those who benefited from his actions. But Anastasia seemed either unaware or unconcerned. By the mid-1930s, he was no longer simply a criminal navigating the underworld. He was a recognized force within it. His name carried weight. His presence shaped decisions. And yet, his foundation remained unstable, built not on alliances or diplomacy, but on intimidation. The boy from Calabria had mastered survival, but had not learned restraint. As the American mafia moved toward a new era of coordination and quiet power, Albert Anastasia stood at a crossroads. He was indispensable, feared, and increasingly isolated. His rise through the shadows was nearly complete, but the same traits that lifted him higher also ensured that his position would never be secure. In a world where patience often outlasted strength, Anastasia's story was only beginning to reveal its deeper tensions. By the time Albert Anastasia reached his early 20s, violence was no longer something that surrounded him, it was something he carried within himself, ready to be used without hesitation. The streets of Brooklyn had refined what Calabria had first taught him. Fear was not accidental, it was manufactured. Respect was not requested, it was enforced. And blood, once spilled, could never be taken back. For Anastasia, this understanding became the foundation of his identity. His early acts of serious violence were not impulsive street fights or reckless displays meant to impress. They were deliberate, purposeful, and increasingly professional. He learned quickly that violence, when applied decisively, simplified problems. A man who resisted today would not resist tomorrow if the message was strong enough. And if the message failed, there were no second warnings. This mindset separated Anastasia from many other young criminals who still believed violence was emotional or personal. To him, it was practical. Police records from the period suggest a steady escalation. Assault charges grew more severe. Weapons became part of his routine. Yet convictions remained rare. Witnesses changed their statements or refused to appear. Victims suddenly remembered things differently. In neighborhoods where Anastasia operated, silence became a form of self-preservation. People learned that speaking openly carried consequences far heavier than staying quiet. It was during this phase that Anastasia discovered an unsettling truth about himself: killing did not disturb him. Where others hesitated or were haunted by their first serious act of violence, Anastasia felt clarity. Fear faded. Purpose sharpened. The emotional distance he maintained allowed him to act repeatedly without the burden of remorse. This absence of hesitation would later become his most feared trait. Those who encountered him during these early years often described his eyes rather than his actions. Cold, focused, unreadable. He did not shout or boast when violence occurred. He acted, then moved on. This calm after brutality unnerved even seasoned criminals. It suggested not rage, but comfort, an acceptance of violence as routine rather than exceptional. As his reputation grew, so did the types of tasks he was assigned. He was no longer just enforcing debts or intimidating rivals. He was eliminating problems. Individuals who caused disruption, defied orders, or threatened operations began to vanish. Bodies were sometimes found, sometimes not. The message, however, was always clear. Anastasia's involvement meant finality. In the criminal underworld, specialization mattered. Some men were planners. Others were negotiators. Anastasia became something else entirely, an executioner. He was the solution when other methods failed. This role brought him closer to the inner circles of organized crime, where trust was limited and betrayal was expected. Ironically, his reliability in carrying out violence earned him a form of trust that words never could. Yet this growing influence came at a cost. Fear is an effective tool, but it does not inspire loyalty in the traditional sense. Those around Anastasia obeyed him, but they did not relax around him. Conversations were guarded. Jokes were rare. Laughter stopped when he entered a room. Even allies understood that proximity to such violence was dangerous. Despite this, Anastasia believed fear was enough. He saw hesitation as weakness and compromise as unnecessary. In his view, decisive action prevented future problems. The idea that restraint could preserve long-term stability did not interest him. His world was immediate, governed by reaction and dominance rather than patience. As organized crime in America began shifting toward centralized control, this philosophy put Anastasia at odds with emerging leaders. Figures like Lucky Luciano envisioned a syndicate that minimized attention, avoided unnecessary bloodshed, and functioned like a business. Violence would still exist, but it would be strategic. Anastasia, however, represented the old reality, a reminder that behind every negotiation stood the threat of force. His early killings also shaped how he was perceived by law enforcement. Though rarely convicted, his name appeared repeatedly in investigations. Detectives whispered about him, frustrated by their inability to build solid cases. Informants were reluctant to speak. Even hardened criminals feared retaliation. Anastasia learned that intimidation extended beyond victims, it reached into institutions meant to stop him. The psychological transformation during this period was subtle but profound. Anastasia stopped seeing individuals and began seeing obstacles. People became variables, useful, neutral, or dangerous. Once someone crossed into the dangerous category, their fate was sealed. This emotional detachment insulated him from guilt but also from human connection. Isolation followed naturally. Yet there were moments, brief and rarely spoken of, when his past seemed to surface. Quiet periods where he drank alone, stared into space, or reacted disproportionately to perceived slights. These flashes hinted at something unresolved beneath the hardened exterior, a reminder that violence, while effective, never truly erases memory. As his body count increased, so did whispers within the underworld. Stories grew darker, more exaggerated. Anastasia's reputation took on a life of its own. Some accounts painted him as uncontrollable, others as ruthlessly efficient. Both were partially true. The myth amplified fear, and fear amplified power. Anastasia understood this dynamic instinctively and did nothing to correct it. By the time he became deeply embedded in organized crimes enforcement mechanisms, his role was firmly established. He was no longer proving himself. He was being relied upon. Decisions made in quiet rooms often ended with a single phrase spoken softly, "Albert will handle it." And once those words were said, the outcome was inevitable. This period marked the point of no return. Whatever path Anastasia might have taken earlier in life was gone. Violence was not merely something he did, it was who he was. It defined his value, his authority, and his future. Every killing pushed him further from redemption and closer to a fate shaped by the same fear he wielded so effectively. Unseen by him, however, was the long shadow these actions cast. Each life taken created ripples of resentment, grief, and quiet calculation. In the world he inhabited, nothing was ever forgotten. Scores were kept silently. Patience replaced outrage. And while Anastasia believed fear guaranteed safety, the seeds of his eventual downfall were already being planted, watered by every act of brutality he committed without hesitation. For now, though, he stood unchallenged, feared, and increasingly indispensable. The making of a killer was complete, and the executioner of America's underworld had fully emerged. As Albert Anastasia's reputation for violence solidified, his world expanded beyond street-level intimidation into the deeper structure of organized crime. Power in this world did not belong to lone figures for long. It required alliances, shared interests, and carefully balanced partnerships. For Anastasia, one of the most significant relationships of his early criminal career would be with Vincent Mangano, a man whose temperament and ambition stood in quiet contrast to his own. Vincent Mangano was older, more measured, and deeply rooted in the traditional Sicilian mafia codes that governed early Italian-American organized crime. Where Anastasia was impulsive and feared, Mangano was cautious and respected. He believed in hierarchy, ritual, and control. Together, they formed a partnership that appeared stable on the surface, blending Mangano's leadership with Anastasia's enforcement. Beneath that surface, however, tension slowly gathered. Their connection strengthened through control of the Brooklyn waterfront. The docks were among the most valuable territories in New York's underworld, serving as gateways for smuggling, theft, and labor manipulation. Mangano held official authority within the crime family structure, while Anastasia served as the muscle that ensured compliance. Longshoremen, union officials, and rival operators learned quickly that resistance was futile. Orders were followed. Payments were made. Silence was maintained. To outsiders, the partnership seemed efficient. Mangano handled administration and political connections. Anastasia handled discipline. This division of labor allowed the family's influence to expand quietly and profitably. Cargo moved as directed. Strikes were suppressed. Rivals backed down without public confrontation. Fear traveled ahead of Anastasia like a warning signal, reducing the need for constant violence. Yet within this arrangement lay a fundamental imbalance. Anastasia's power came from fear, not position. Mangano's authority came from title and recognition within the mafia hierarchy. This distinction mattered deeply in a world where legitimacy, even among criminals, carried weight. Mangano saw himself as the leader. Anastasia increasingly saw himself as indispensable. That difference, subtle at first, would eventually become fatal. Anastasia grew impatient with what he perceived as Mangano's caution. Meetings, discussions, and delays frustrated him. In his view, hesitation weakened authority. Problems should be eliminated quickly, decisively, without debate. Mangano, however, understood the importance of restraint, especially as law enforcement scrutiny intensified. He believed survival depended on blending in, not standing out. Their disagreements were rarely open. In the mafia, open conflict signaled weakness. Instead, tension manifested through silence, strained conversations, and divided loyalties. Anastasia's men began looking to him rather than Mangano for direction. Fear proved more immediate than tradition. Loyalty shifted quietly, without announcements. As Anastasia's influence grew, so did his connections beyond the Mangano family. His close relationships with figures like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky positioned him within a broader national syndicate that valued efficiency over old-world ritual. These alliances subtly undermined Mangano's authority, placing Anastasia closer to the future of organized crime than his nominal superior. Mangano sensed the shift. He grew increasingly distrustful of Anastasia, viewing him as reckless and dangerous, not only to enemies, but to the family itself. Attempts were made to restrain him, to limit his actions, to remind him of hierarchy. These efforts only deepened Anastasia's resentment. He believed his loyalty and effectiveness entitled him to greater autonomy. The atmosphere between them grew colder. Meetings became formal, devoid of warmth. Decisions were second-guessed. Rumors circulated. In the criminal world, rumors were rarely idle. They were signals, warnings that alliances were fraying. Both men understood that their partnership could not remain unchanged. What made the situation especially volatile was Anastasia's temperament. He did not respond well to perceived disrespect. Challenges to his authority, however subtle, triggered anger. Mangano's attempts to assert control likely felt, to Anastasia, like betrayal. In a world governed by fear and loyalty, betrayal demanded response. The disappearance of Mangano's brother, Philip Mangano, would later deepen suspicion and fuel speculation. Philip had been a quiet but loyal supporter of Vincent, often acting as an intermediary. His sudden vanishing unsettled the underworld. No body was found. No explanation was offered. Silence followed, thick and ominous. Soon after, Vincent Mangano himself disappeared. Again, no body. No public acknowledgement. In the mafia, such absences spoke louder than confessions. The implication was clear, even if unspoken. Anastasia's role was widely assumed, though never officially confirmed. The lack of evidence ensured that certainty remained out of reach, protected by the same fear that had enabled Anastasia's rise. The partnership was over. In its place stood a power vacuum, one that Anastasia was uniquely positioned to fill. His fearsome reputation, combined with his alliances within the national syndicate, allowed him to ascend without formal challenge. Yet this ascent carried a heavy cost. The manner in which Mangano vanished unsettled even hardened criminals. It suggested that tradition and hierarchy no longer offered protection. For Anastasia, the removal of Mangano marked both triumph and transformation. He was no longer merely an enforcer or partner. He had crossed into leadership through violence rather than consensus. This distinction mattered deeply within the mafia's evolving structure. While some respected his strength, others quietly questioned the wisdom of allowing such a volatile figure to hold power. The disappearance of the Mangano brothers lingered like a shadow over Anastasia's reign. It served as a reminder of how quickly alliances could collapse and how decisively power could be seized. It also planted seeds of distrust that would never fully fade. Those who benefited from Mangano's removal understood that if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. In the short term, Anastasia's position strengthened. The docks remained under firm control. Profits continued to flow. Opposition retreated into silence. But beneath the surface, fear replaced respect, and stability gave way to unease. The alliance that had once balanced violence with restraint was gone, replaced by a rule defined almost entirely by intimidation. This chapter of Anastasia's life marked a crucial turning point. It demonstrated both his capacity to seize power and his inability to share it peacefully. The partnership with Mangano, once a foundation, became a cautionary tale whispered quietly in back rooms. It showed that while fear could elevate a man quickly, it also ensured that he would never rule without enemies. As Anastasia stood alone at the top, the echoes of the past partnership followed him. The quiet understanding within the underworld was clear: power taken through blood invited blood in return. The alliance that had built his ascent had collapsed, and the path forward, though powerful, was increasingly lonely and dangerous. As Albert Anastasia's power consolidated, the nature of violence around him began to change. No longer was it the chaotic street brutality of early Brooklyn or the impulsive enforcement of dockyard disputes. Violence became organized, scheduled, and deliberate. It transformed into a service, quietly requested and efficiently delivered. This shift marked the emergence of what would later be known as Murder, Incorporated, a name that sounded almost fictional, yet described a very real mechanism within America's criminal underworld. The organization was never a formal company, never registered or openly discussed. It functioned instead as a network, bound by trust, secrecy, and absolute obedience. At its core was a simple principle: when a problem could not be solved through intimidation, negotiation, or bribery, it could be erased. Murder became an administrative solution, carried out at a distance from those who ordered it. Anastasia was central to this system, not because he planned every killing, but because he enforced discipline and certainty within it. Operating primarily during the 1930s and early 1940s, Murder, Incorporated drew its members largely from Italian and Jewish gangs based in Brooklyn, particularly the Brownsville area. These men were selected not for intellect or ambition, but for reliability. They followed orders without question, traveled when told, and returned without explanation. Anastasia understood that hesitation was the enemy of efficiency. Once an order was approved, doubt had no place. Unlike the spontaneous violence of earlier years, these killings were methodical. Targets were studied. Schedules observed. Locations chosen for maximum effectiveness and minimal attention. Weapons varied: guns, knives, ice picks, but the emphasis was never on spectacle. Speed and finality mattered more than drama. The goal was disappearance, not headlines. Anastasia's leadership within this system was defined by presence rather than paperwork. He did not manage lists or assign contracts in writing. Instructions were delivered face to face, often with few words. A nod, a name, a destination. That was enough. Those receiving orders understood the stakes. Failure was not an option. Survival depended on completion. His reputation ensured compliance without constant oversight. Men knew that if they failed, Anastasia would not forgive mistakes. Fear maintained quality control. In this way, Murder, Incorporated functioned with a grim consistency that unsettled even those who benefited from it. The organization was effective precisely because it lacked mercy. For the National Crime Syndicate, this system solved a persistent problem. Leaders wanted disputes resolved quietly, without public wars that attracted police attention. By outsourcing murder to a centralized group, they insulated themselves from direct involvement. Anastasia served as the gatekeeper, ensuring that requests were legitimate and aligned with syndicate interests. This role placed him in a position of immense, if informal, authority. Yet with this authority came deep resentment. Many mafia bosses accepted Murder, Incorporated as a necessary evil but were uncomfortable with the power Anastasia wielded. He controlled not just violence, but access to it. A denied request meant a problem remained unsolved. An approved one meant irrevocable consequences. This imbalance disturbed the carefully maintained hierarchy of organized crime. Anastasia, however, showed little concern for these sensitivities. He believed effectiveness justified authority. In his view, those unwilling to do what was necessary forfeited the right to decide. This philosophy clashed with the evolving vision of leaders who sought longevity over domination. But for the moment, his usefulness outweighed his flaws. The emotional toll on those within Murder, Incorporated was significant, though rarely discussed. Many of the men were young, drawn into a cycle of killing that left little room for reflection. Anastasia did not concern himself with their psychological well-being. To him, they were instruments. Their fear, loyalty, or guilt mattered only insofar as it affected performance. Law enforcement, meanwhile, struggled to understand the scope of the organization. Murders occurred across states, often with no clear motive or suspect. Patterns were suspected but difficult to prove. Witnesses were scarce. Evidence disappeared. Anastasia's name surfaced repeatedly, but always just beyond reach. The very structure that made Murder, Incorporated effective also made it elusive. As the years passed, the organization's body count grew. Estimates varied, but the number was substantial enough to cement Anastasia's reputation as the most feared man in American crime. The press would later label him the Lord High Executioner, a title that captured both his role and his detachment. Anastasia neither embraced nor rejected the label. It simply reflected reality. Despite his central role, Anastasia remained personally involved in violence when he deemed it necessary. He did not see himself as above the work. This willingness reinforced his authority and maintained his image as someone who shared the risks he imposed on others. It also revealed his inability, or unwillingness, to separate himself from the brutality that defined his rise. Within the syndicate, debates quietly intensified. Some leaders began to question whether Murder, Incorporated attracted too much attention. Trials loomed. Informants emerged. The very efficiency that once protected the organization now threatened to expose it. Anastasia resisted calls for restraint, viewing them as signs of weakness. This resistance further isolated him. While he remained powerful, the network around him grew cautious. Allies began to distance themselves, limiting contact and reducing dependence. The seeds of future betrayal were planted during this period, though Anastasia seemed unaware or unconcerned. For him, Murder, Incorporated was not merely a tool, it was validation. It confirmed his belief that violence, when controlled, was the ultimate solution. It reinforced his identity as indispensable, untouchable. Yet this belief blinded him to a critical truth: systems built entirely on fear eventually provoke collective resistance. As the organization neared its eventual collapse, driven by prosecutions and internal fractures, Anastasia's role became increasingly controversial. Some saw him as a relic of an era that needed to end. Others feared that removing him would destabilize everything. For the moment, inertia preserved his position. But beneath the surface, change was inevitable. Murder, Incorporated had achieved its purpose, but at a cost too high to sustain indefinitely. And Albert Anastasia, its most powerful symbol, stood unknowingly at the center of a structure already beginning to crumble. As Albert Anastasia's authority expanded, fear became more than a tool, it became the atmosphere around him. People did not simply obey him, they adjusted their behavior in his presence. Voices softened. Eyes lowered. Even seasoned criminals measured their words carefully, aware that unpredictability was his most dangerous trait. This reputation earned him a nickname whispered with unease, the Mad Hatter. It was not meant as mockery, but as warning. Anastasia's temper was legendary. Unlike leaders who cultivated calm and restraint, he erupted without notice. A minor insult, a perceived delay, even an imagined slight could provoke explosive rage. These outbursts were not performances. They were genuine expressions of a man who saw opposition everywhere and tolerated none of it. Those closest to him understood that survival depended not on loyalty alone, but on constant vigilance. Yet fear alone does not explain his leadership. There were moments when Anastasia displayed warmth, even generosity. He paid well. He rewarded loyalty. Families of those who served him faithfully were often protected and provided for. This duality confused those around him. Acts of kindness made his violence harder to predict, intensifying anxiety rather than easing it. No one ever felt fully safe, even when favored. Meetings under Anastasia's authority were tense affairs. He rarely sat still. He paced, smoked, watched faces closely. Silence stretched uncomfortably. When he spoke, it was often brief, decisive, and final. Disagreement was not invited. Questions were tolerated only if they confirmed obedience. The absence of discussion created an environment where mistakes multiplied, driven by fear rather than clarity. This leadership style contrasted sharply with the evolving norms of organized crime. Figures like Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese believed power should be quiet, patient, and nearly invisible. Anastasia's volatility threatened this vision. His public reputation attracted attention. His impulsive acts risked exposure. For men invested in long-term survival, his behavior felt increasingly dangerous. Anastasia, however, saw restraint as vulnerability. In his experience, hesitation invited challenge. Fear, once established, prevented conflict. This belief had served him well in the past, reinforcing his confidence in its effectiveness. He dismissed concerns from others as cowardice, convinced that decisive action preserved authority. His paranoia grew alongside his power. He trusted fewer people. Bodyguards rotated frequently. Routes changed. Even allies sensed distance. Conversations were filtered. Information was compartmentalized. This isolation deepened his reliance on fear, creating a feedback loop that intensified his volatility. The more alone he felt, the more aggressively he asserted control. Despite this, Anastasia maintained a disciplined public appearance. He dressed impeccably, favored fine restaurants, and moved through elite social circles. To outsiders, he appeared confident, almost serene. This contrast between outward composure and inner volatility unsettled those who knew him well. It suggested that violence was never far from the surface, waiting for permission to emerge. Stories circulated within the underworld, some exaggerated, others painfully accurate. Men beaten for speaking out of turn. Orders reversed mid-sentence. Executions authorized over perceived disrespect. Whether every tale was true mattered less than the belief that they could be. Reputation, in Anastasia's world, was reality. This atmosphere affected decision-making throughout the organization. Subordinates avoided bringing problems to him, fearing his reaction. Issues festered. Opportunities were missed. Mistakes multiplied. Fear stifled initiative. While Anastasia believed he ruled efficiently, his leadership increasingly undermined stability. Those who interacted with him learned to read subtle cues. A tightened jaw. A prolonged stare. A sudden silence. These signs dictated behavior more reliably than any spoken rule. Survival depended on emotional intelligence rather than competence. In such an environment, loyalty became fragile, maintained by fear rather than respect. Even within his own family, relationships strained under the weight of his temperament. Domestic life offered little refuge. Trust eroded. Tension followed him everywhere. Sleep was restless. Anger lingered. The very fear he cultivated externally mirrored itself internally, eroding any sense of peace. For rival leaders, Anastasia's volatility became both a threat and an opportunity. His unpredictability made him dangerous in the short term but vulnerable in the long term. Allies began to consider alternatives, quietly imagining a future without him. The question was not whether his leadership would end, but when and how. Yet confronting him directly was unthinkable. His reputation ensured that opposition remained silent. Plans, if any, formed slowly, shielded by patience and secrecy. In the meantime, Anastasia continued ruling as he always had, convinced that fear guaranteed loyalty. What he failed to see was that fear, while powerful, does not inspire devotion. It breeds calculation. It teaches people to wait. Every outburst, every unpredictable act, pushed others closer to the conclusion that stability required his removal. The Mad Hatter persona, once an asset, became a liability. It defined him too completely, leaving no room for adaptation. In a world evolving toward subtlety, Anastasia remained bound to brutality. His leadership style, forged in chaos, could not adjust to changing realities. As time passed, the gap between his self-perception and others' perceptions widened. He believed himself untouchable, protected by fear and legacy. Others saw a man increasingly isolated, dangerous, and expendable. This disconnect would shape the final chapters of his life. For now, though, Anastasia remained in control. His name still silenced rooms. His presence still dictated outcomes. But beneath the surface of obedience, the underworld was learning a dangerous lesson: fear may enforce order, but it also teaches patience. And patience, when combined with quiet resolve, would eventually prove stronger than rage. In the underworld Albert Anastasia inhabited, disappearances spoke louder than confessions. There were no announcements, no explanations, only absence. When men of stature vanished, the silence that followed carried meaning. It was in this quiet, unsettling language that the fate of the Mangano brothers was written, and with it, the most decisive turning point in Anastasia's rise to absolute power. Philip Mangano was the first to vanish. He was not a public figure in the way his brother Vincent was, but he was deeply trusted and closely involved in the family's affairs. Philip often acted as a messenger and intermediary, smoothing over tensions and ensuring communication flowed where pride might otherwise block it. When he failed to appear for meetings and could not be reached, concern rippled quietly through the organization. Questions were asked cautiously. No answers came. Days turned into weeks. No body was found. No rumor solidified into certainty. Yet in the mafia, uncertainty itself was a signal. People began to adjust their behavior, sensing that something irreversible had occurred. Philip's absence left Vincent Mangano increasingly isolated, stripped of a loyal ally at a moment when his authority was already under strain. Vincent Mangano, by contrast, could not simply disappear unnoticed. As the recognized head of the family, his presence anchored the hierarchy. Yet not long after his brother vanished, Vincent too was gone. Meetings were missed. Calls unanswered. Messages returned without reply. The underworld watched carefully, understanding that such an absence could only mean one thing. No body ever surfaced. No official accusation was made. The lack of evidence ensured that truth remained locked behind fear. Yet few doubted what had occurred. The implication was clear enough to require no confirmation. Albert Anastasia, once Mangano's partner and enforcer, now stood alone. The disappearance of the Mangano brothers unsettled even hardened criminals. While violence was expected, the removal of a recognized leader without public justification crossed an unspoken line. It suggested that titles and tradition no longer guaranteed safety. Power, it seemed, now belonged to whoever could seize it and hold it through force. Anastasia's reaction to the disappearances was telling. He neither denied involvement nor acknowledged it. He continued his routines, attended meetings, issued orders. Silence became his shield. In the mafia, denial invited scrutiny. Silence commanded acceptance. Those who understood this language interpreted his calm as confirmation. The vacuum left by the Mangano brothers' disappearance demanded resolution. Leadership could not remain undefined for long. The National Syndicate, aware of the destabilizing potential, quietly moved to formalize Anastasia's position. Though some harbored doubts, his control over enforcement and his alliances with powerful figures made opposition impractical. Anastasia's ascension was less a coronation than an acknowledgement of reality. He had already been acting as leader. Now the title followed. Yet the manner of his rise lingered uncomfortably in the background. Fear secured obedience, but it also sharpened caution. Those beneath him complied, but they watched carefully. The disappearances reinforced Anastasia's reputation as someone who eliminated threats without hesitation. This image deterred immediate challenges but deepened long-term resentment. Men who once relied on tradition now understood that proximity to Anastasia carried risk. Loyalty was no longer enough. Survival required invisibility. Within the broader mafia structure, reactions were mixed. Some leaders accepted the outcome as inevitable, viewing the Mangano brothers as relics of an older era. Others saw Anastasia's actions as destabilizing, a reminder of unchecked brutality. These leaders did not confront him openly, but they remembered. Law enforcement, as usual, arrived too late. Investigations stalled without bodies or witnesses. Files were opened, then quietly closed. Frustration mounted, but fear remained effective. The truth stayed buried beneath layers of silence. Psychologically, the removal of the Mangano brothers marked a shift in Anastasia himself. He had crossed from enforcer to kingmaker, from subordinate to sovereign. This transition emboldened him. He believed his authority was now unquestionable, validated by both fear and recognition. Yet the cost of this transformation was isolation. Allies became wary. Conversations grew shorter. Trust eroded. Anastasia surrounded himself with loyalists, but loyalty based on fear lacks depth. It fractures under pressure. Unbeknownst to him, the foundation of his power was already weakening. The disappearance of the Mangano brothers became a cautionary tale whispered quietly in back rooms. It served as both warning and precedent. It showed how quickly alliances could dissolve and how decisively power could be seized. It also taught others that patience, not confrontation, was the safest response to tyranny. For Anastasia, the moment marked the peak of his confidence. He believed himself untouchable, protected by fear and necessity. He dismissed concerns as weakness, convinced that decisive action had secured his reign. In the short term, he was correct. No one challenged him openly. Profits continued to flow. Order, of a sort, was maintained. But beneath the surface, calculations were underway. Men who had once relied on tradition began to imagine alternatives. Leaders who valued stability began to question whether Anastasia's volatility endangered everyone. The disappearances, rather than silencing dissent, had transformed it into something quieter and more patient. The Mangano brothers were gone, erased without ceremony. Their absence reshaped the underworld, altering the balance of power in ways that would take years to fully unfold. Albert Anastasia stood alone at the top, surrounded by silence that masked both obedience and growing resolve. In the world he ruled, nothing was forgotten. The quiet removal of two brothers would echo far into the future, a reminder that power seized through fear invites a reckoning. For now, though, the shadows closed around the truth, and Albert Anastasia's reign entered its most dangerous phase, one defined not by open war, but by the calm before a carefully planned storm. With the Mangano brothers gone and no rival strong enough to challenge him directly, Albert Anastasia stepped fully into the role of a boss. The transition was not marked by celebration or ceremony. There were no speeches, no public acknowledgments. In the world he ruled, power was recognized through behavior, not announcements. Orders were followed. Prophets were delivered. Silence remained intact. That was confirmation enough. Anastasia's authority rested on two pillars, fear and necessity. Those beneath him understood that resistance invited consequences. Those above him in the broader syndicate structure recognized that his control over enforcement made him indispensable. Together, these forces created a fragile balance, one that elevated Anastasia while quietly limiting his room to maneuver. As boss, he oversaw a crime family that controlled critical sections of the Brooklyn and Manhattan waterfronts, union operations, and various rackets tied to shipping and labor. These enterprises generated steady income, but they also required careful management. Anastasia, however, showed little interest in administration. He delegated details to subordinates, focusing instead on maintaining dominance. Meetings under his leadership were brief and tense. He tolerated no prolonged discussion. Decisions were made quickly, often impulsively. While this approach eliminated hesitation, it also reduced strategic planning. Problems were solved in the moment, without regard for long-term consequences. For a time, this worked. Fear compensated for inefficiency. Yet the criminal landscape was changing. Law enforcement pressure increased. Media scrutiny intensified. The old days of open intimidation were fading. Other mafia leaders adapted by becoming quieter, more cautious. Anastasia resisted this shift. He believed that visibility reinforced authority. His presence was meant to intimidate not just rivals, but his own organization. This approach unsettled his peers. Leaders like Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese favored subtlety. They believed survival depended on blending in, avoiding unnecessary attention. Anastasia's volatility threatened their careful calculations. While they respected his power, they questioned his judgment. Anastasia's paranoia deepened as his power grew. He trusted fewer people, suspecting betrayal everywhere. Bodyguards were rotated. Meetings relocated unexpectedly. Allies were tested. This environment eroded morale within his family. Loyalty, once enforced through fear, began to feel brittle. Despite this, Anastasia enjoyed the privileges of leadership. He lived well, surrounded by luxury that contrasted sharply with his humble beginnings. Fine suits, expensive meals, and exclusive social circles became part of his daily life. Yet comfort did not bring peace. His sleep was restless. His temper remained volatile. Power did not calm him, it amplified his insecurities. His leadership style also affected his standing within the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia. While he held a seat, his influence was uneven. Other bosses listened, but they did not confide. Decisions were made cautiously around him. His unpredictability made him difficult to trust in collective planning. Anastasia's insistence on control through fear began to clash with the Commission's emphasis on stability. Violence, once a necessary tool, was now seen as a liability. Anastasia's readiness to use it threatened the delicate balance the Commission sought to maintain. Quietly, doubts formed. Within his own family, dissent remained unspoken but present. Capos and soldiers followed orders, but they watched closely. Mistakes were punished harshly. Initiative was discouraged. The organization functioned, but without cohesion. Fear kept it together, but did not inspire loyalty. Anastasia's relationship with his peers grew strained. He viewed their caution as weakness. They viewed his aggression as recklessness. This mutual misunderstanding widened over time, creating an invisible divide. Anastasia stood at the center of power, yet increasingly isolated. Law enforcement continued its pursuit, though success remained elusive. Investigations targeted unions, dark operations, and known associates. Anastasia's name surfaced repeatedly, but evidence remained thin. Fear protected him as effectively as any lawyer. Yet the very qualities that shielded him also marked him as expendable. As other leaders refined their strategies, Anastasia appeared increasingly out of step with the times. His authority, while formidable, lacked the adaptability needed for longevity. Anastasia seemed unaware of this shift. He believed his position was secure, reinforced by decades of fear and violence. He dismissed warnings and ignored subtle changes in behavior around him. His focus remained on immediate control rather than future survival. The crown he wore was heavy, forged through blood and intimidation. It granted him power, but it also drew attention. Every decision was scrutinized. Every outburst remembered. Every act of violence added to a growing ledger of grievances. As boss, Anastasia had achieved what few could. He ruled through fear, commanded respect, and controlled significant resources. Yet his reign was built on unstable ground. The very methods that secured his rise now threatened his position. Unseen by him, alliances were shifting. Men who once relied on his strength began to question whether his presence endangered them. Patience replaced fear. Calculation replaced obedience. The calm obedience he observed masked deeper currents. Albert Anastasia stood at the peak of his power, yet the structure beneath him was quietly eroding. His leadership, unquestioned on the surface, was increasingly contested in silence. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would not come through open conflict, but through the same quiet efficiency he had once mastered himself. By the time Albert Anastasia sat among the most powerful figures in American organized crime, the structure governing that world had changed dramatically from the chaos of earlier decades. The commission had been created to prevent the very kind of bloodshed that once defined mafia life, endless vendettas, impulsive killings, and public wars that drew unwanted attention. It was designed to impose order, balance power, and ensure that no single boss became reckless enough to endanger everyone. In theory, the commission was the ultimate authority. In practice, its power depended on cooperation and restraint. Anastasia represented a fundamental challenge to this system. He was not opposed to the commission itself, but he did not fully submit to its philosophy. Where the commission favored consensus and patience, Anastasia favored decisiveness and fear. He believed that hesitation bred weakness and that authority, once questioned, had to be reasserted immediately. This difference in worldview placed him in constant, unspoken tension with the very body meant to regulate him. The commission brought together leaders like Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Tommy Lucchese, and others who viewed organized crime as a long-term enterprise. They valued invisibility. Their goal was not dominance through terror, but stability through quiet influence. Businesses were to run smoothly. Violence was to be rare, purposeful, and discreet. In their minds, Anastasia's volatility threatened decades of careful progress. Meetings of the commission were exercises in restraint. Voices were measured. Disagreements were framed diplomatically. Decisions emerged slowly, shaped by compromise. Anastasia tolerated these gatherings, but he did not embrace them. He often appeared impatient, visibly restless during discussions he considered unnecessary. When he spoke, his words were blunt, sometimes unsettling in their simplicity. Problems, he insisted, should be removed, not debated. Other bosses listened carefully when Anastasia spoke, not because they agreed, but because they feared the consequences of ignoring him. His control over enforcement and his legacy as a killer gave his opinions weight. Yet this influence was double-edged. Each time he pushed for violence where others sought restraint, he reinforced the perception that he was dangerous, not just to enemies, but to the organization itself. Anastasia's presence on the commission also exposed his limitations. He lacked patience for political maneuvering. He distrusted prolonged negotiation. He interpreted compromise as concession. These traits, while effective on the streets, proved problematic in a council designed to prevent unilateral action. Carlo Gambino, in particular, embodied everything Anastasia was not. Calm, calculating, and nearly invisible, Gambino believed power should never announce itself. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and waited longer than others were comfortable with. Where Anastasia relied on fear, Gambino relied on loyalty and foresight. Their coexistence was uneasy, marked by mutual awareness rather than open hostility. Vito Genovese, too, watched Anastasia closely. Ambitious and strategic, Genovese understood the value of patience. He saw Anastasia as both a tool and an obstacle. Useful when violence was required, but dangerous if left unchecked. Genovese did not confront Anastasia directly. He observed, waited, and remembered. Within the commission, Anastasia increasingly found himself isolated. Decisions were shaped quietly before meetings, leaving him reacting rather than leading. Alliances formed without his involvement. Discussions continued after he left the room. None of this was visible on the surface, but the shift was unmistakable to those attuned to power dynamics. Anastasia responded to this isolation by asserting himself more aggressively within his own family. He tightened control, punished perceived disloyalty swiftly, and reinforced fear as the primary means of governance. This approach may have restored a sense of authority locally, but it further alienated him from the broader leadership. The Commission's greatest concern was not Anastasia's violence itself, but its unpredictability. Controlled violence could be managed. Impulsive violence could not. Each unapproved killing risked retaliation, investigation, or internal conflict. Anastasia's tendency to act first and justify later undermined the Commission's purpose. Despite these concerns, removing him was unthinkable, at least openly. Anastasia's power base was strong. His reputation ensured that any direct challenge would be met with severe consequences. Moreover, the Commission prided itself on stability. Removing a sitting boss required consensus and careful planning. Patience, not force, was the preferred method. Anastasia misread this restraint as acceptance. He believed his position secure, his authority unquestioned. The absence of confrontation reassured him. He mistook silence for loyalty, caution for agreement. In doing so, he failed to recognize the quiet shift occurring around him. As law enforcement pressure increased, the Commission grew more committed to reducing visibility. High-profile figures became liabilities. Anastasia, with his well-known reputation and volatile behavior, increasingly fit that category. Discussions began framing him not as an asset, but as a risk. These conversations were subtle, cloaked in hypotheticals and long-term planning. No names were spoken openly. No decisions announced. Yet direction was established. The question was no longer whether Anastasia posed a problem, but how long that problem could be tolerated. Anastasia, meanwhile, continued to operate as he always had. He enforced obedience. He demanded loyalty. He relied on fear. He dismissed concerns about perception and publicity. To him, authority meant control in the present moment. The future could be handled when it arrived. But the Commission existed precisely to think beyond the present. Its members understood that survival depended on anticipation. They watched Anastasia carefully, noting each outburst, each unauthorized act, each sign that his behavior was becoming less manageable. By the mid-1950s, the contrast was unmistakable. The mafia had evolved into a quieter, more calculated organization. Anastasia remained a symbol of an earlier, bloodier era. His presence reminded others of a past they were eager to leave behind. Yet history rarely moves without resistance. Anastasia would not step aside willingly. His identity was bound to power, and power to fear. Any attempt to curtail his authority would be perceived as betrayal. The Commission understood this. Whatever came next would require patience, coordination, and silence. For now, the balance held. Anastasia remained a boss, a Commission member, and a figure of immense fear. But beneath the surface, the logic of order was steadily overtaking the rule of chaos. And in that quiet shift, Albert Anastasia's fate was being decided, not by force, but by consensus, calculation, and time. At the height of his power, Albert Anastasia lived a life that appeared, on the surface, to be the reward for decades of brutality. Fine suits tailored to his broad frame, expensive restaurants where staff knew his preferences without asking, ocean views that suggested calm and permanence, these were the visible signs of success. Yet beneath this carefully constructed comfort lay a constant, gnawing unease. Power had brought him luxury, but it had not brought him peace. Anastasia's days followed routines designed not for relaxation, but for survival. He varied his movements, changed schedules without notice, and surrounded himself with men whose sole purpose was protection. Even moments meant to be ordinary, meals, walks, visits to familiar places, were calculated risks. He trusted few, and even those few were kept at a distance. The fear he had cultivated in others had quietly turned inward. Luxury, for Anastasia, was not indulgence but insulation. Fine homes and private spaces offered a buffer between him and the unpredictable world he ruled. Yet no wall was thick enough to block suspicion. Every sound carried potential meaning. Every unfamiliar face triggered assessment. His mind rarely rested. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by vigilance honed over a lifetime. Those close to him noticed the change. His temper, always volatile, became sharper. Small irritation sparked outsized reactions. Paranoia crept into conversations. He questioned loyalty constantly, testing those around him with sudden demands or contradictory instructions. Compliance was expected instantly. Any hesitation was remembered. Despite this tension, Anastasia maintained the image of confidence. Publicly, he appeared composed, authoritative, even relaxed. He moved through elite circles with ease, his presence commanding attention without effort. To outsiders, he looked like a man who had mastered his world. Few understood the cost of that mastery. His home life offered little refuge. Relationships were strained by secrecy and mistrust. Family members lived under the shadow of his reputation, protected yet isolated. Normalcy was impossible. Friends were few. Privacy was limited. Even in moments of quiet, the weight of past actions lingered. Anastasia's wealth allowed him access to the best of everything, yet enjoyment remained elusive. Pleasure was fleeting. Satisfaction short-lived. Each achievement raised the stakes, increasing the number of people who might benefit from his downfall. He understood this intellectually, but his nature prevented him from stepping back. As his paranoia deepened, so did his reliance on control. He micromanaged loyalty, demanded constant reassurance, and reacted harshly to perceived slights. This behavior strained relationships within his organization. Subordinates complied, but enthusiasm faded. Fear maintained order, but resentment accumulated quietly. The contrast between Anastasia and his peers became more pronounced. Other bosses embraced invisibility, blending into suburban neighborhoods, minimizing attention. Anastasia, by contrast, remained conspicuous. His reputation preceded him. His name was known to law enforcement, journalists, and criminals alike. This notoriety, once a source of pride, became a liability. Yet Anastasia could not imagine a different way of living. His identity was inseparable from power, and power from fear. To relinquish control would mean vulnerability, and vulnerability was intolerable. He dismissed caution as weakness, convinced that his methods had carried him this far and would continue to do so. The irony was unmistakable. The more he sought security through dominance, the more isolated he became. Allies grew distant. Conversations became guarded. Trust eroded. He was surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. Moments of reflection were rare, but when they came, they were unsettling. Memories of Calabria, of hunger and instability, surfaced unexpectedly. The boy who had fled poverty now sat surrounded by wealth, yet felt no safer. The journey had changed circumstances, not instincts. Anastasia's fear of betrayal intensified as whispers reached him, subtle shifts in tone, delayed responses, unexplained absences. He sensed change but could not identify its source. His reaction was to tighten control further, a response that only accelerated the process he feared. In public spaces, he remained alert. He chose seating carefully, watched entrances, and noted exits instinctively. Conversations were scanned for subtext. Humor rarely relaxed him. Laughter, when it occurred, sounded forced. The performance of ease masked a constant readiness for violence. The luxury that surrounded him became almost surreal, a thin veneer over a life defined by vigilance. Fine dining lost its flavor. Beautiful views offered no comfort. Even moments of silence were suspect, filled with imagined threats. Those who observed him closely saw a man trapped by his own legend. The Mad Hatter persona had consumed the individual beneath it. Expectations dictated behavior. Any display of vulnerability would undermine authority. He was required, by reputation alone, to remain dangerous. As years passed, the gap between appearance and reality widened. Anastasia looked powerful, but his power was increasingly brittle. It depended on fear rather than loyalty, on isolation rather than alliance. This made it effective in the short term, fragile in the long term. Unbeknownst to him, others had begun to view his paranoia not as caution, but as instability. His reactions, once seen as decisive, were now interpreted as reckless. The luxury he displayed contrasted sharply with the risk he represented. In quiet rooms far from his presence, conversations continued. Calculations were made. Alternatives considered. Anastasia's lifestyle, once the envy of lesser men, became evidence that he was out of step with the times. Still, he remained convinced of his invincibility. He had survived too much, overcome too many challenges, to believe his end would come quietly. He expected confrontation, betrayal in the open, violence he could see coming. What he did not understand was that the greatest danger was not noise, but silence. Not rage, but patience. The life of luxury he led was not a fortress, but a stage. And behind the scenes, the final act was already being prepared, unseen by the man who believed fear would protect him forever. As Albert Anastasia continued to rule through fear and unpredictability, the world around him shifted with quiet precision. The most dangerous changes did not announce themselves. They unfolded slowly, through lowered voices, delayed responses, and carefully timed absences. Among those watching most closely was Vito Genovese, a man whose ambition was matched only by his patience. Where Anastasia dominated through intimidation, Genovese preferred shadows, believing that true power moved silently. Genovese had learned long ago that survival in organized crime depended not on strength alone, but on timing. He understood alliances, grudges, and the value of letting others make mistakes. Anastasia's volatility, once a useful weapon, increasingly appeared to Genovese as an opportunity. Every outburst, every unauthorized act of violence, every moment of public exposure strengthened the case against him. Unlike Anastasia, Genovese cultivated relationships patiently. He listened more than he spoke. He rarely displayed anger. Instead, he allowed others to reveal themselves, storing information for future use. This approach earned him trust, particularly among those unsettled by Anastasia's behavior. Complaints were never voiced directly, but they were remembered. The plotting that began during this period was not driven by hatred, but by calculation. Anastasia was not merely disliked, he was seen as a liability. His presence threatened the careful balance the Commission sought to maintain. Genovese and others understood that removing him would not be easy. Fear protected Anastasia as effectively as loyalty once had. Any move against him would require consensus and discretion. The first step was isolation. Without confrontation, Anastasia's influence within the commission began to wane. Meetings were scheduled without his input. Decisions were framed in ways that minimized his role. He was consulted, but not confided in. This subtle marginalization was intentional. It reduced his ability to retaliate and increased his dependence on a shrinking circle of supporters. Carlo Gambino's role in this quiet shift was equally significant. Gambino, like Genovese, favored stability over dominance. He understood that Anastasia's volatility endangered everyone. While he never openly challenged Anastasia, he quietly positioned himself as a safer alternative. His calm demeanor reassured those who feared chaos. Trust flowed toward him naturally. Together, Genovese and Gambino represented a new model of leadership, measured, discreet, and adaptable. They did not need to rush. Time worked in their favor. Anastasia, bound to impulse, would eventually expose himself further. Within Anastasia's own organization, cracks widened. His paranoia alienated capable subordinates. Fear suppressed initiative. Mistakes went unreported until they became crises. Genovese's allies observed these weaknesses carefully, noting which men might shift allegiance when given the chance. Law enforcement pressure also played a role. Public figures attracted scrutiny. Anastasia's notoriety made him a focal point for investigators and journalists. Genovese, by contrast, remained largely invisible. This difference mattered deeply to leaders concerned with longevity. The risk calculus began to favor removal over tolerance. Communication during this period was indirect. Messages passed through intermediaries. Intentions were hinted at, never stated. The language of organized crime relied on implication. Genovese understood this fluently. He allowed others to reach conclusions on their own, ensuring that when action came, it would appear inevitable rather than conspiratorial. Anastasia sensed the shift but misinterpreted its meaning. He perceived distance as disrespect and responded by asserting control more aggressively. This reaction reinforced concerns about his stability. Each attempt to tighten his grip accelerated his isolation. The plotting reached beyond personal ambition. It was framed as a necessity for the organization's survival. Removing Anastasia was discussed not as betrayal, but as correction. This framing allowed participants to justify their actions internally, reducing hesitation. The most delicate aspect was timing. Anastasia could not be confronted openly. He needed to be removed without triggering chaos or retaliation. This required patience and precision. The plan would have to be executed swiftly, decisively, and with minimal exposure. As consensus grew, the question shifted from whether to act to how. Genovese and his allies considered locations, routines, and vulnerabilities. Anastasia's habits, once a source of security, now became liabilities. His belief in routine, despite constant caution, created predictability. Throughout this period, Anastasia remained unaware of the depth of opposition forming against him. He sensed hostility, but underestimated its coordination. He believed fear would prevent action. He failed to recognize that fear, once shared, could unify. The irony was profound. Anastasia's greatest strength, his reputation for violence, had prevented challenges for years. Now, that same reputation convinced others that removal was the only solution. Negotiation was impossible. Coexistence unsustainable. Genovese waited. He allowed circumstances to mature. He ensured alliances were firm. He understood that once action was taken, there could be no reversal. The silence surrounding these preparations was intentional, designed to lull Anastasia into complacency. In the quiet moments before the storm, the balance of power had already shifted. Anastasia remained boss in name and presence, but his authority was hollowing out. Decisions were being made elsewhere, by men who valued order over fear. The stage was set. The plotting was complete, though invisible to its target. Albert Anastasia continued his routines, confident in his dominance, unaware that patience had finally overtaken terror. And in the stillness of this unseen conspiracy, the end of his reign drew closer, shaped not by anger, but by cold, collective resolve. By the mid-1950s, the question of Albert Anastasia's future was no longer abstract. What had once been quiet dissatisfaction had matured into something more deliberate. Within the highest levels of organized crime, tolerance had reached its limit. The violence, the unpredictability, the constant risk of exposure, these were no longer inconveniences to be managed, but threats that demanded resolution. And in the language of the underworld, resolution required permission. The commission was not a court in the traditional sense, but its authority was absolute. Decisions made within its circle carried the weight of law, even when unspoken. For a sitting boss to be removed, there needed to be more than personal dislike. There needed to be consensus that his continued existence endangered the structure itself. Slowly, carefully, that consensus formed. Discussions were indirect. No one proposed murder outright. Instead, conversations revolved around stability, long-term interests, and unnecessary attention. Anastasia's name surfaced without being spoken, implied through examples and hypotheticals. Everyone understood. No one needed clarification. The danger he posed was obvious to all present. Carlo Gambino emerged as the quiet beneficiary of these discussions. Calm, methodical, and deeply trusted, he represented continuity without chaos. He did not push for action openly. He allowed others to reach the conclusion on their own. This restraint strengthened his position. When the time came, his ascension would feel natural rather than forced. Vito Genovese, meanwhile, ensured alignment behind the scenes. He reinforced the narrative that Anastasia's volatility threatened everyone equally. He reminded others of past wars, of leaders who had fallen because they refused to adapt. His arguments were not emotional. They were pragmatic. Survival required change. The most critical element was agreement not to intervene. In the world of organized crime, permission was often expressed through absence. To approve a killing did not require a vote or a statement. It required silence. It required assurance that no retaliation would follow. It required a shared understanding that when the act occurred, it would be accepted as necessary. That understanding settled quietly into place. Once this threshold was crossed, Anastasia's fate became inevitable. The remaining question was execution, not in principle, but in practice. Timing mattered. Location mattered. The method had to be decisive, public enough to send a message, yet controlled enough to avoid chaos. Anastasia himself sensed none of this clearly. He felt tension, yes, but he attributed it to envy and fear. He believed his reputation insulated him from betrayal. The idea that the commission itself might withdraw protection never fully registered. He could not imagine a world in which he was expendable. His routines continued, though modified by paranoia. He changed cars, varied schedules, and relied on trusted bodyguards. Yet even the most cautious habits contain patterns. Over time, predictability returns. And in predictability, vulnerability is born. Those planning his removal studied these patterns patiently. They did not rush. They waited for conditions to align. Anastasia's sense of invulnerability worked in their favor. The more confident he became, the more relaxed he allowed himself to be. Within his own family, no warning reached him. Fear ensured silence. Those who suspected what was coming chose self-preservation over loyalty. In this world, survival depended on reading the future correctly. And the future, increasingly, did not include Albert Anastasia. The Commission's withdrawal of protection was absolute, though invisible. Once it occurred, Anastasia stood alone, surrounded by guards who could not protect him from a decision made above their reach. His power, once anchored by syndicate necessity, was now hollow. This moment marked the true turning point. The man who had enforced countless deaths without hesitation now existed on borrowed time. The system he had served, and often terrorized, had decided it no longer needed him. Ironically, Anastasia's own philosophy had helped shape this outcome. He believed in decisive action, in removing problems rather than managing them. That same logic was now being applied to him. The underworld had learned from him, and now it acted accordingly. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final warning. The commission did not summon him, did not demand reform. They knew such gestures would fail. Anastasia would not change. He could not. His identity was fixed, his behavior predictable. In the days leading up to his death, Anastasia continued as usual. He attended meetings, issued orders, dined publicly. He remained alert, but not alarmed. He believed danger announced itself loudly. He underestimated silence. The final decision, once reached, carried a strange calm. There was no excitement, no celebration. For those involved, it was business, unpleasant but necessary. The removal of a volatile element to preserve stability. History repeating itself in quieter form. When the moment arrived, it would not feel like an attack on a king. It would feel like closure. A correction. The end of an era that no longer fit the shape of the world around it. Albert Anastasia had built his reign on fear, convinced that terror guaranteed permanence. What he failed to understand was that fear, when shared by many, becomes unity. And unity, when guided by patience, becomes destiny. The commission had spoken without words. Protection had been withdrawn without notice. And somewhere in the city, a routine day was approaching its final, irreversible moment, one that would transform Albert Anastasia from ruler to cautionary tale, from executioner to executed, without a single warning sound. The morning of November 25, 1957, arrived without warning or omen. New York moved through its routines as it always had, streets filling with traffic, shop doors opening, conversations beginning and ending without consequence. For Albert Anastasia, the day carried no special significance. It was not marked by meetings of consequence or signs of danger. It appeared, in every outward sense, ordinary. Anastasia rose as he always did, alert but untroubled. He dressed carefully, selecting a tailored suit that reflected both wealth and authority. Appearance mattered to him. It was a signal, a reminder of who he was and how he expected to be treated. He left his home accompanied by bodyguards, his movements calculated, his demeanor calm. Years of paranoia had sharpened his instincts, but nothing that morning suggested immediate threat. He traveled to the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, a place he knew well. Inside, the hotel's barbershop offered privacy, routine, and familiarity. It was a controlled environment, one he had visited before without incident. The barbershop was small, quiet, warmly lit. A place where time slowed, where a man could sit still for a moment without appearing vulnerable. Anastasia entered, removed his coat, and settled into the barber's chair. He relaxed his shoulders, allowing the familiar ritual to begin. His bodyguards remained outside. This was not unusual. The barbershop felt safe. Routine breeds comfort, even for men who live surrounded by danger. Inside the room, mirrors reflected the scene back at itself. The hum of clippers filled the air. The barber moved carefully, focused on his work. Anastasia closed his eyes briefly, a rare moment of stillness. For years, his life had been defined by tension and vigilance. In that chair, for that brief span of time, he allowed himself to rest. Then the door opened. Two men entered quickly, purposefully. They wore hats pulled low, coats concealing weapons. Their movements were coordinated, practiced. There was no hesitation, no exchange of words. In the mirror, Anastasia's reflection caught the motion. His eyes opened just as realization began to form. He rose instinctively, knocking the chair backward. Whether he reached for a weapon or attempted to stand fully remains unclear. What is certain is that there was no time. Gunfire erupted, loud and sudden, tearing through the quiet room. The sound echoed sharply against tile and glass. Anastasia was struck repeatedly. He staggered, reaching toward the mirror, his hands leaving marks on the surface as he fell. Bullets continued until motion ceased. The entire act lasted seconds. Precision, not rage, defined the moment. When it was over, the gunmen turned and left as swiftly as they had entered. The barbershop fell silent. Smoke lingered in the air. The barber stood frozen, stunned by the violence that had shattered the routine. Blood spread across the floor, pooling beneath the fallen body of a man who had once commanded fear across an entire criminal empire. Albert Anastasia lay motionless, his reign ended not in a public war or dramatic confrontation, but in a small room designed for comfort and routine. Outside, the city continued moving. Passers-by were unaware of what had just occurred behind the hotel's walls. Traffic flowed. Conversations continued. Only moments later did the significance of the act begin to ripple outward. Police arrived quickly, summoned by witnesses and the unmistakable sound of gunfire. They found a scene of controlled brutality. No struggle beyond the initial attempt to rise. No sign of the killers beyond shell casings and fading echoes. The gunmen were gone, absorbed into the city as if they had never existed. Anastasia's bodyguards rushed in too late. Their presence, once a symbol of protection, now felt meaningless. The decision that had sealed his fate had been made far beyond their reach. No amount of loyalty could reverse it. News spread rapidly. Within hours, the underworld knew. There was shock, but little surprise. For many, the assassination confirmed what had been quietly anticipated. Anastasia's death was not random. It was deliberate, sanctioned, final. Law enforcement launched an investigation, but it was constrained from the start. Witnesses were few and terrified. Descriptions vague. Leads evaporated. The killers had planned carefully, choosing a location where escape was simple and identification unlikely. The case would remain officially unsolved, like so many others tied to organized crime. Within the mafia, reaction was measured. There was no public mourning, no overt retaliation. Silence prevailed. This silence spoke volumes. It signaled acceptance. The absence of chaos confirmed that the killing had been approved at the highest levels. Anastasia's death marked the end of an era defined by open brutality. His assassination was not merely the removal of a man, but the conclusion of a philosophy. Fear had ruled his world, and fear had ultimately united others against him. The symbolism of the location was not lost on those who understood the language of power. A barbershop represented vulnerability, routine, trust. Killing Anastasia there sent a message: no place was beyond reach once protection was withdrawn. Even the most feared men could be found in moments of stillness. For those who had lived under his rule, the immediate aftermath was marked by uncertainty. Power vacuums invite chaos, yet none came. Leadership transitioned quietly. Control shifted without bloodshed. This, too, was a message. Anastasia's body was removed, his name added to a long list of men who had ruled through fear and died through silence. The city moved on quickly. Headlines faded. Conversations shifted. Time absorbed the shock. Yet the moment lingered in memory. The image of a powerful man falling in a place of routine became legend. It reinforced a lesson deeply embedded in the criminal world: power without consensus is temporary. Fear without loyalty is fragile. Albert Anastasia had lived by violence, enforced order through terror, and dismissed caution as weakness. In the end, he was undone not by a rival's rage, but by collective patience. His death was swift, efficient, and quiet, everything his reign had not been. As the echoes of gunfire faded from the barbershop walls, a chapter of American organized crime closed. The executioner had been executed. And in the stillness that followed, the underworld exhaled, ready to reshape itself without the man who had once embodied its darkest edge. In the immediate aftermath of Albert Anastasia's death, the most striking feature was not chaos, but calm. The violent removal of one of the most feared men in American organized crime might have been expected to trigger retaliation, confusion, or open warfare. Instead, the underworld responded with silence and swift adjustment. This quiet response revealed more about the nature of power than any public reaction could have. Within hours, the news had reached every corner of the mafia's network. Phones rang briefly, messages were passed discreetly, and then communication slowed. No orders for revenge were issued. No emergency meetings erupted into shouting. The absence of response itself served as confirmation that Anastasia's death had been sanctioned. Those who understood the language of organized crime recognized that nothing further would happen, not because it could not, but because it would not. Anastasia's closest associates were left stunned but restrained. Fear, once their guide, now offered no direction. Without the protection of commission approval, any attempt at retaliation would have been suicidal. Loyalty dissolved quietly, replaced by self-preservation. Men who had once enforced Anastasia's will now waited, watched, and recalibrated. The waterfront operations continued uninterrupted. Dock workers reported for duty. Union officials followed instructions as usual. Payments flowed. The machinery of organized crime did not pause to mourn. This continuity was deliberate. It demonstrated that Anastasia, despite his reputation, had not been indispensable. The system functioned without him. Law enforcement, meanwhile, launched a public investigation. Detectives questioned witnesses, collected evidence, and issued statements. Yet behind the formalities lay a familiar frustration. Witnesses were evasive. Descriptions conflicted. Fear sealed mouths. The case, though high-profile, lacked the substance needed for resolution. Within weeks, momentum slowed. The investigation joined a long list of unsolved crimes. The press reacted with fascination. Headlines described Anastasia as a crime lord, a murderer, a symbol of brutality. Articles speculated about suspects, motives, and the future of the mafia. Yet even as journalists explored the drama, they missed the deeper truth: the real story was not the killing, but the absence of reaction. Within the mafia, meetings resumed under new assumptions. Conversations were cautious but purposeful. Leaders reassured allies and subordinates that stability would be maintained. There would be no upheaval, no bloodshed, no disruption of business. This reassurance was critical. It prevented panic and reinforced the authority of those poised to assume control. Carlo Gambino emerged quietly as the primary beneficiary. His calm demeanor and reputation for discretion offered exactly what the organization needed: continuity without volatility. His ascension was not declared publicly, but it was understood. Those who mattered adjusted their loyalties accordingly. For the rank and file, Anastasia's death brought mixed emotions. Some felt relief, freed from the constant tension of unpredictable leadership. Others felt unease, aware that fear had simply shifted form. Violence remained a possibility, but it would now be applied selectively, quietly, without spectacle. The immediate power scramble that many expected never materialized. This absence highlighted how thoroughly the transition had been planned. The Commission's involvement ensured that no vacuum existed. Authority moved smoothly from one set of hands to another, reinforcing the illusion of permanence. Anastasia's family, removed from the operational realities of the underworld, faced a different aftermath. Grief was private, complicated by the nature of his life. Protection remained, but influence faded. The legacy of fear offered no comfort in loss. In the weeks that followed, Anastasia's name was spoken less frequently. In organized crime, memory is selective. Names associated with instability fade quickly. Those who survive adapt. The Mad Hatter, once a central figure, became a reference point, a cautionary example rather than a presence. The efficiency of the transition sent a message beyond New York. Other crime families observed closely, taking note of how decisively volatility had been removed. The lesson was clear: power required not just strength, but alignment. Those who threatened the collective would be corrected, regardless of reputation. Law enforcement officials recognized the implications as well. The lack of retaliatory violence suggested coordination at the highest levels. Yet without evidence, this recognition remained academic. The system that protected organized crime from disruption remained intact. Public fascination lingered briefly, then shifted. New stories replaced old ones. The city absorbed the event, as it had so many before. Life continued. For those who had lived under Anastasia's rule, the change was subtle but profound. Meetings became calmer. Decisions took longer. Violence decreased. The fear that had once dominated daily life receded, replaced by a quieter, more controlled form of authority. Stability, not dominance, became the guiding principle. Anastasia's death also altered the internal culture of his former family. Kapos gained more autonomy. Soldiers operated with clearer expectations. Mistakes were addressed methodically rather than explosively. This shift reduced tension and increased efficiency. Yet the cost of this calm was not negligible. The brutality that had enforced obedience was replaced by calculation. Betrayal became more sophisticated. Trust remained scarce. The underworld did not become kinder, it became smarter. In the end, Anastasia's absence reshaped organized crime in ways his presence never could. His reign, defined by fear, ended quietly. His removal reinforced a new order, one that valued patience over rage, subtlety over spectacle. The aftermath of his assassination revealed the ultimate truth of his legacy: he had been powerful, but not essential. Feared, but not irreplaceable. The system he helped enforce absorbed his loss and moved forward without hesitation. As time passed, Albert Anastasia's name joined the long list of men who had ruled through terror and fallen through silence. His death did not mark the end of organized crime, nor even a pause. It marked a refinement, a shift toward a darker, quieter efficiency that would define the decades to come. And in that silence, the echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of a world that had learned, once again, how to move on without looking back. In the wake of Albert Anastasia's assassination, the underworld of New York began a subtle but profound transformation. The power vacuum created by his sudden removal demanded resolution, yet the streets remained deceptively calm. The organization he had ruled through fear and unpredictability needed a new leader, someone capable of maintaining order while avoiding the volatility that had defined Anastasia's tenure. Carlo Gambino emerged quietly, almost imperceptibly, as the figure best suited to assume this mantle. Gambino's rise was not dramatic. There were no gunfights, no public ceremonies, no overt assertions of dominance. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated transition, facilitated by the Commission and sanctioned by those who understood the necessity of stability. Unlike Anastasia, Gambino relied not on terror, but on subtlety, patience, and an almost invisible command of influence. Where Anastasia had been immediate, forceful, and unpredictable, Gambino was deliberate, strategic, and disciplined. One of the first signs of Gambino's effectiveness was the seamless continuity of operations. The docks remained under control. Union operations continued without disruption. Illegal enterprises, from cargo theft to gambling, functioned as before. Soldiers and kapos adapted quickly to the new leadership, recognizing that their loyalty now required alignment with discretion rather than fear. In contrast to the Mad Hatter's reign, where even minor mistakes could trigger violent reprisal, Gambino cultivated an environment where obedience was rewarded with protection and calculated guidance. Gambino understood the lessons Anastasia had left behind. Fear alone, he knew, could not sustain long-term authority. It could intimidate, but it could not inspire loyalty. The most effective leadership in organized crime required a balance, sufficient strength to command respect, but sufficient restraint to prevent rebellion or law enforcement scrutiny. Gambino embodied this philosophy. He projected authority without spectacle, presence without ostentation, control without chaos. Within the commission, Gambino's emergence was welcomed by those who had long sought a stabilizing force. Leaders such as Vito Genovese, who had quietly plotted against Anastasia, recognized in Gambino a partner capable of maintaining the delicate balance between enforcement and diplomacy. His temperament, measured, calm, and predictable, made him reliable in the eyes of the syndicate. Unlike Anastasia, Gambino did not unsettle the collective with unpredictable behavior. He was, in essence, the antithesis of the Mad Hatter. This stability extended to external operations as well. Gambino maintained relationships with other families, mediating disputes and ensuring cooperation. His approach minimized open conflict, reducing the risk of law enforcement attention. Under his guidance, the family evolved into a more structured and sustainable entity. Profitability continued, but it was now accompanied by discretion and foresight. The transformation was not merely organizational, it was cultural. Anastasia's reign had normalized sudden violence, impulsive decisions, and fear-driven compliance. Gambino shifted the culture toward calculation, patience, and strategic restraint. Orders were delivered clearly but without unnecessary aggression. Mistakes were corrected, not punished impulsively. Soldiers and capos began to internalize a new set of expectations, emphasizing long-term planning over short-term dominance. Gambino's personal style reinforced this shift. He was deliberate in speech, choosing words that conveyed authority without anger. He moved through public spaces with care, avoiding unnecessary attention. Where Anastasia's presence demanded focus and caution from everyone nearby, Gambino's presence instilled calm confidence. Men understood the power behind his name, but they also understood that it would not be exercised without reason. This approach enhanced loyalty. Subordinates were less fearful, more cooperative, and increasingly invested in the organization's stability. Fear had been replaced by respect, and respect by trust, though still cautious, tempered by the lessons of the past. Gambino's subtlety ensured that authority was internalized, rather than externally imposed, creating a cohesion Anastasia had never achieved. Externally, other crime families adapted quickly. Gambino's rise did not provoke conflict because it was deliberate, coordinated, and sanctioned. Alliances were reinforced. Opportunities for cooperation were emphasized. Violence, when employed, was measured and strategic, rather than impulsive. Gambino understood that perception mattered as much as action. His authority derived not only from power, but from the careful cultivation of legitimacy. The broader effect on New York's underworld was profound. Where fear had once dominated, calculation now prevailed. The lesson was clear: the most enduring power is subtle, adaptive, and disciplined. Gambino's leadership style marked a departure from the bloody spectacle that had defined Anastasia's reign. It represented an evolution of organized crime, one where longevity was valued over immediate dominance, and strategy over impulse. Gambino himself understood the precariousness of his position. He knew that the same forces that had removed Anastasia could, in time, threaten him. His approach emphasized prevention. By minimizing unnecessary risks, fostering alliances, and ensuring cohesion, he insulated himself from the volatility that had undone his predecessor. In this way, he converted the lessons of fear into tools of stability. This transition also highlighted the adaptability of organized crime as a system. The removal of a single, even powerful, figure did not destabilize operations. Instead, the system absorbed the change, recalibrated, and continued functioning. Gambino's ascension was both a product and a confirmation of this resilience. Authority shifted without open conflict, proving that power in the underworld could be transferred quietly when necessity dictated. Gambino's rise did not erase Anastasia's legacy. The Mad Hatter remained a cautionary figure, his methods remembered and discussed in quiet rooms. His brutality, once a defining characteristic of authority, now served as a historical example of what excessive volatility could produce. In contrast, Gambino's measured approach offered a model for sustainable leadership. The shift also affected law enforcement perceptions. Whereas Anastasia's notoriety had drawn scrutiny, Gambino's discretion reduced exposure. Investigations proceeded, but the organization's operations became harder to penetrate. Gambino's leadership demonstrated the strategic advantage of invisibility and calculation over spectacle and fear. In essence, Carlo Gambino's rise marked a turning point not just for one family, but for the broader structure of organized crime in New York. Anastasia's reign had been defined by immediacy, unpredictability, and terror. Gambino's reign would be defined by patience, subtlety, and stability. The underworld had learned from the past, and the lessons were applied with quiet precision. For those within the organization, the contrast was stark. Fear no longer dictated every action. Authority became predictable, reliable, and enforceable without chaos. The family functioned efficiently. Decisions were calculated. Alliances were reinforced. The focus shifted from short-term displays of power to long-term sustainability. In this environment, Gambino thrived. He understood human behavior, the value of patience, and the power of perception. Where Anastasia relied on immediate action and force, Gambino relied on timing, diplomacy, and subtle influence. The result was a crime family that was stronger, more cohesive, and more resilient than it had been under its infamous predecessor. Albert Anastasia's death had created an opportunity. Carlo Gambino seized it not through violence, but through strategy. He filled the void left by the Mad Hatter, converting fear into respect, volatility into stability, and chaos into order. His ascension demonstrated that in the world of organized crime, power is not only measured by fear or force, but by foresight, discretion, and the ability to maintain control without revealing the full extent of it. Albert Anastasia's life has long occupied a space between legend and reality, a figure whose actions have been recounted in whispers, in press articles, and in the collective imagination of those fascinated by the mafia. To examine him purely through the lens of myth is to risk overlooking the complexity of the man behind the reputation, yet to see him only as a man is to risk underestimating the fear he commanded and the system he embodied. The truth lies somewhere between these extremes, shaped by environment, opportunity, and personal choice. Anastasia was often portrayed as a monster, a ruthless executioner, a man whose temper was as volatile as his aim. Stories of his violence, his unpredictability, and his capacity to kill without hesitation have been told and retold, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes verified. These accounts cemented his reputation, creating an almost mythical figure whose presence alone could silence a room or enforce obedience. Yet, like many legends, the image of the unflinching killer simplifies a life that was far more complex. Born into poverty in Calabria, Italy, Anastasia's early experiences shaped his worldview in ways that went beyond criminality. Violence, scarcity, and survival were constants. Respect was not given, it was enforced. Authority was observed, tested, and sometimes eliminated. For a young man in such an environment, the lessons were clear: to endure, one had to adapt, to assert strength, and to navigate both fear and loyalty with precision. The skills he acquired in childhood, resilience, observation, and calculation, became the foundation for a life that would later terrify an entire city. Immigration to America presented both opportunity and danger. In Brooklyn's crowded streets, among other immigrants struggling to survive, Anastasia found a world that mirrored the lessons of his youth, but amplified. Labor disputes, union corruption, and criminal organizations created a space where his combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and adaptability could thrive. Early acts of violence were not mindless but tactical, learned through observation, tested through action, and reinforced by success. The streets became a crucible, refining instincts that had been shaped by poverty and loss. Within this context, it is possible to view Anastasia not only as a perpetrator of violence, but as a product of circumstance. His environment rewarded brutality and decisiveness, punishing hesitation and weakness. The line between survival and transgression was blurred. While he made conscious choices, those choices were influenced by a system that valued obedience, intimidation, and the elimination of threats. Understanding this context does not excuse his actions, but it provides insight into why he became the figure he did. Anastasia's role in Murder, Incorporated illustrates this duality vividly. As an enforcer, he carried out killings that were authorized, often requested, and strategically planned. He operated within a network that saw murder not as personal vendetta but as administrative necessity. His efficiency and willingness made him indispensable, yet also feared. Within this system, Anastasia's violence was both a personal trait and a function of structural necessity, a convergence of individual capacity and organizational demand. At the same time, Anastasia was not without personal contradictions. Those who knew him often described moments of generosity, loyalty, and unexpected humanity. He rewarded faithful associates, provided for families, and maintained a network of relationships that went beyond fear. These facets of his character complicate the simple narrative of a remorseless killer. They suggest a man capable of nuance, even as his public persona demanded terror. Yet his flaws were equally pronounced. His impulsive temper, unpredictable behavior, and reliance on fear created instability, not only for his enemies but for his own organization. He alienated allies, provoked scrutiny, and undermined the long-term security that more strategic leaders prioritized. In many ways, Anastasia's strengths were inseparable from his weaknesses, the same traits that elevated him, decisiveness, ruthlessness, and instinct, also exposed him to vulnerability. The myth surrounding Anastasia grew not only from his actions, but from the dramatic contrast between his image and the world around him. Media reports, law enforcement accounts, and later popular portrayals emphasized violence, flamboyance, and unpredictability. This reinforced public perception, creating a caricature that overshadowed subtler realities. In the collective imagination, Anastasia became a symbol of organized crime itself, fear incarnate, decisive and untouchable, yet operating within a system that eventually turned against him. Revisiting his life with a focus on reality reveals a more balanced perspective. Anastasia was a product of his era, environment, and personal choices. He navigated a criminal ecosystem that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others, and he did so with remarkable skill. His actions were guided by both self-interest and systemic necessity. His decisions were informed by the harsh logic of survival and ambition, rather than by the morality of ordinary life. Furthermore, examining his story highlights the role of context in shaping historical memory. Anastasia's legend owes as much to circumstance and perception as to fact. The fear he inspired amplified every account, ensuring that small acts of violence were magnified in importance, and that personal flaws were interpreted as proof of inherent monstrousness. In reality, the man was shaped by forces both external and internal, by opportunity, risk, and environment, as much as by innate temperament. Anastasia's downfall, similarly, reflects the interplay between individual behavior and collective action. His elimination was not sudden or arbitrary, it was the result of patient planning, organizational consensus, and recognition of risk. The very fear that had elevated him now made him a target. Leaders who understood stability, patience, and collective interest acted decisively to remove the anomaly. In this sense, his death was as much a product of systemic logic as of personal vendetta. In retrospect, Anastasia's life offers lessons about the intersection of personality, environment, and history. He illustrates how extreme behavior can thrive under certain conditions, and how systems of power reward traits that, in other contexts, might be disastrous. His myth demonstrates the human tendency to simplify complex figures into symbols, monsters, legends, icons, while reality is often messy, shaped by circumstance and choice alike. Ultimately, separating myth from reality does not diminish the fear he inspired or the consequences of his actions. Violence, intimidation, and murder were central to his life, and those acts affected countless individuals and families. But recognizing the broader context allows for a fuller understanding of Anastasia as both a man and a symbol, a product of circumstance, a participant in a violent system, and an individual whose choices both reflected and shaped the underworld he inhabited. In balancing myth and reality, Anastasia emerges as neither purely monster nor entirely man, but as a complex figure operating in a world that demanded extremes. His life and death illustrate the interplay between fear and strategy, volatility and order, reputation and reality. The legend endures, in part, because it simplifies, but the historical truth, messy, ambiguous, and layered, reveals a man shaped by forces larger than himself, yet profoundly responsible for the terror he wielded. In the years following Albert Anastasia's assassination, the machinery of organized crime in New York underwent profound transformation. The era that had tolerated open displays of violence, intimidation, and volatile leadership gradually gave way to a new order, one defined by calculation, discretion, and strategic patience. At the center of this evolution was the dismantling of Murder, Incorporated, the notorious network of contract killers that had operated across the United States, carrying out executions for the national syndicate with eerie efficiency. This decline marked not merely the end of an organization but the close of an entire approach to power that had defined the Mad Hatter's reign. Murder, Incorporated had been a system as much as a collective of men, structured to enforce authority through fear and finality. Its members were selected for their reliability, their willingness to execute orders without hesitation, and their ability to vanish into anonymity once a task was complete. The organization had functioned as a shadow government within organized crime, carrying out decisions with the precision of administration rather than the chaos of impulse. Albert Anastasia, with his temperament, experience, and reputation, had been central to this system. He was both enforcer and overseer, ensuring that operations proceeded efficiently and that discipline remained absolute. For years, his presence gave the organization a sense of invincibility, a certainty that orders would be executed and questions silenced. Yet this very efficiency sowed the seeds of its undoing. Each murder, each act of intimidation, each execution carried a ripple effect, and over time, these ripples reached the eyes and ears of law enforcement. The sheer scale of coordinated killings could not remain invisible indefinitely. Investigations began quietly at first, probing individual incidents, interviewing witnesses, and gathering evidence in painstaking secrecy. As the net tightened, the organization's inherent vulnerabilities became clear. Men who had once operated without accountability began to slip, whether through mistakes, personal grievances, or fear. The turning point came with a combination of luck, intelligence, and relentless legal pressure. Prosecutors and detectives recognized that to dismantle Murder, Incorporated, they would need testimony from insiders, men who understood the system from the inside out. Over time, several members, motivated by self-preservation or leniency agreements, began to cooperate with authorities. These informants provided details about operations, hierarchies, and the roles of key figures. Names that had once been whispered only in fear were now revealed in courtrooms, under oath, with precise recollection. The effectiveness of the organization, once its greatest strength, became its vulnerability. The meticulous records, careful coordination, and predictable patterns provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to build cases. As trials progressed, the perception of Murder, Incorporated began to shift. No longer an untouchable network, it became a cautionary tale, demonstrating that even the most efficient structures could be penetrated by patience, observation, and legal strategy. The very anonymity and detachment that had protected members could not shield them indefinitely from the consequences of their actions. The public, fascinated by the scale and methodical nature of the killings, became aware of the organization's operations, and newspapers chronicled the unraveling with sensational detail, further undermining its mystique. Albert Anastasia's death had already removed the organization's most prominent enforcer and overseer, and in doing so, it disrupted the internal chain of command. Without him, the cohesion that had enabled rapid decision-making and swift action weakened. Men who had once operated under his direct supervision became uncertain, hesitant, and more prone to mistakes. This instability accelerated the decline, as those seeking to distance themselves from risk either fled the organization, turned informant, or were removed by others seeking to preserve personal security. Simultaneously, the internal culture of Murder, Incorporated began to shift. Fear, which had previously ensured absolute compliance, now generated anxiety and mistrust. Members were acutely aware of law enforcement scrutiny, of potential betrayals, and of the changing expectations within the broader criminal network. The once clear chain of command blurred, and the calculated precision that had defined the organization eroded under pressure. The prosecutions that followed were meticulous. Courts heard testimonies that revealed not only individual acts of violence, but also the organizational structure, strategic intent, and oversight mechanisms that had allowed such acts to occur with alarming regularity. These trials established precedents for holding organized crime accountable, demonstrating that systematic criminal enterprises could be dismantled through patience, strategic investigation, and witness cooperation. The resulting conviction sent a clear message: efficiency in violence does not equate to impunity. As the organization disintegrated, the criminal landscape evolved. Power shifted to leaders who prioritized discretion over spectacle. The overt brutality that had defined Anastasia's era became less valued, replaced by subtle influence, strategic alliances, and long-term planning. The lessons learned from Murder, Incorporated's rise and fall informed the practices of subsequent leaders, emphasizing risk management, internal loyalty, and the careful exercise of authority. Despite the dismantling of Murder, Incorporated, its legacy endured. Its members' actions had left an indelible mark on organized crime, establishing the precedent that killing could be systematized, coordinated, and executed with bureaucratic precision. Yet the organization's collapse also demonstrated the limits of such methods. The reliance on fear, efficiency, and secrecy could sustain power temporarily, but it could not protect against coordinated external pressure or internal betrayal. In essence, Murder, Incorporated illustrated both the potency and the fragility of a structure built entirely around violence. For those who had served under Anastasia, the decline of Murder, Incorporated offered both relief and caution. Relief, because the omnipresent threat of execution was diminished; caution, because the dismantling illustrated that no system, no matter how efficient or terrifying, could remain impervious indefinitely. The balance of power had shifted. Leaders who survived the dismantling learned to prioritize strategy over aggression, patience over impulse, and discretion over spectacle. The end of Murder, Incorporated also signaled a broader transformation in American organized crime. The syndicates began to operate more like businesses, emphasizing revenue generation, risk mitigation, and strategic alliances rather than sheer brutality. Violence, when employed, was targeted and measured, reserved for situations where subtle influence failed. The lessons of Anastasia's era, both the power it conferred and the vulnerabilities it exposed, were absorbed into the strategic calculus of the next generation of crime leaders. In reflecting on this decline, it becomes clear that Albert Anastasia's role was both central and instructive. He had personified the era in which open violence, intimidation, and fear were primary tools of authority. His leadership and participation in Murder, Incorporated demonstrated how an individual's temperament, combined with systemic opportunity, could dominate an entire criminal network. Yet his removal, and the subsequent dismantling of the organization, illustrates the limitations of such power. Systems built on fear and efficiency alone are ultimately vulnerable to patience, coordination, and strategic insight. By the time the trials concluded and Murder, Incorporated ceased to function as a cohesive entity, the underworld had entered a new phase. Anastasia's absence, combined with the legal dismantling of the organization he had once led, allowed other figures, notably Carlo Gambino, to implement a model of leadership grounded in subtlety, control, and long-term strategy. The lessons of Murder, Incorporated informed both enforcement and governance, ensuring that fear alone would no longer dictate power. Ultimately, the decline of Murder, Incorporated marks the closing of an era. The period of overt, organized, and systematic violence, personified by Albert Anastasia, gave way to a more calculated, disciplined form of organized crime. The legacy of these events endures as both cautionary tale and historical lesson. Brutality can build empires, but only adaptability, discretion, and foresight ensure their survival. Anastasia's life, his influence over Murder, Incorporated, and the organization's eventual dismantling collectively illustrate the intricate interplay between fear, structure, and the relentless pressures of both law and collective authority. Even decades after Albert Anastasia's death, his story continued to echo through the underworld, offering lessons about power, strategy, and the consequences of unchecked violence. The man who had once ruled through terror, executed with precision, and commanded absolute obedience became a case study for subsequent generations of criminals and historians alike. The patterns of his rise and fall reveal fundamental truths about organized crime, the delicate balance between fear and loyalty, the necessity of discretion, and the inevitability of collective action when individual volatility threatens stability. Anastasia's life demonstrated that personal power could dominate for a time, but it was never absolute. Fear, while effective in enforcing immediate compliance, does not inspire long-term loyalty. Associates may obey, but only in the moment, while they remain able to assess survival for themselves. When authority is based primarily on intimidation, it creates a hidden calculus among those beneath it: observe, wait, and exploit weakness. Anastasia's assassination by forces sanctioned quietly by the Commission illustrates this principle vividly. The very terror he wielded had, over time, unified those around him in patience, strategy, and inevitability. This pattern holds relevance beyond Anastasia's personal story. In any system where power is exercised without consultation, restraint, or structure, there emerges a tipping point where the collective interest overrides individual authority. In Anastasia's case, the Commission's approval, an invisible but decisive signal, allowed his elimination to occur efficiently and without open conflict. Leaders who observed him understood that his unpredictability threatened organizational cohesion, profitability, and safety. Rather than confronting him impulsively, they exercised patience, coordination, and subtlety, the very tools Anastasia had rarely employed. The consequences of his death illustrate another enduring lesson: the removal of a dominant figure does not always destabilize a system. In the short term, there is shock, uncertainty, and recalibration. For Anastasia's family, his death necessitated rapid adjustment to the loss of leadership and protection. Yet the broader syndicate maintained continuity. Operations continued. Alliances persisted. The system absorbed the change and functioned efficiently. This highlights the resilience inherent in well-structured organizations. Authority is not solely about one individual, but about networks, procedures, and consensus. Anastasia's life also underscores the importance of perception in power dynamics. His reputation was central to his authority. Fear traveled faster than deeds, stories of brutality preceded him and ensured compliance. Yet the same reputation that had elevated him ultimately contributed to his downfall. It made him a target, visible not only to rivals but also to law enforcement, the press, and even the Commission itself. In power structures, visibility can be a double-edged sword. Excessive prominence, especially when paired with volatility, attracts scrutiny and consolidates opposition. Another facet of Anastasia's story is the interplay between individual capability and systemic opportunity. His childhood in Calabria taught him resilience, decisiveness, and the utility of force. His arrival in New York offered a context in which these traits could be leveraged for rapid advancement. Yet while circumstance enabled his rise, it also imposed limits. Operating within the syndicate, where alliances, consensus, and collective authority mattered, unchecked aggression could not protect him indefinitely. The intersection of personal skill and systemic constraint defines the trajectory of many historical figures, illustrating that success in complex systems requires both aptitude and adaptation. The broader implications for organized crime are equally instructive. Anastasia's methods, immediate, visible, and reliant on terror, contrast with the approach of leaders who followed him, such as Carlo Gambino. Gambino's success was grounded in discretion, strategic patience, and the careful management of perception. By studying Anastasia's rise and fall, subsequent generations learned that efficiency in violence and decisiveness in action are insufficient without the stabilizing influence of strategy, patience, and the cultivation of loyalty that extends beyond fear. Anastasia's life also invites reflection on the moral and psychological dimensions of leadership through violence. He exemplified the capacity for ruthless efficiency, yet this efficiency exacted personal costs. Isolation, paranoia, and the constant expectation of betrayal shaped his daily existence. Fear, once wielded outwardly as a tool, circled inward, creating a world in which trust was scarce and vigilance was constant. This pattern is common in environments where authority is maintained primarily through intimidation. The higher the perceived power, the greater the burden of protection and the deeper the psychological toll. The enduring fascination with Anastasia's story in popular culture and historical study reflects society's broader interest in the dynamics of power and morality. He is both cautionary tale and legend, a man whose accomplishments are inseparable from his methods, whose rise demonstrates effectiveness, and whose fall illustrates vulnerability. By examining the full arc of his life, scholars and observers can better understand how leadership, strategy, and personal temperament interact within hierarchical, high-stakes systems. Furthermore, Anastasia's legacy highlights the role of collective action in maintaining organizational stability. The decision to remove him was not unilateral, it required coordination, patience, and consensus. This principle extends beyond crime. In any network system, when a single actor becomes disruptive, the group will often act strategically to restore balance. Anastasia's story exemplifies how long-term survival depends not solely on individual strength, but on alignment with systemic interests. For contemporary observers, both within and outside criminal contexts, the lessons are clear. Power based on fear alone is inherently unstable. Authority achieved through brutality may command immediate obedience but risks eventual isolation and elimination. Conversely, influence that balances decisiveness with discretion, visibility with subtlety, and strength with strategy can endure beyond the lifespan of any single individual. Anastasia's life and death provide a vivid demonstration of these dynamics. Finally, the echoes of Anastasia's story continue to resonate as historical and cultural touchstones. The Mad Hatter, once feared across New York, has become a symbol of the dual nature of power, its capacity to inspire obedience and its vulnerability to patient, coordinated opposition. His life serves as a study in contrasts, strength and fragility, fear and respect, chaos and order. These lessons extend beyond the underworld, offering insight into leadership, human behavior, and organizational dynamics in any context where authority, risk, and loyalty intersect. In sum, Albert Anastasia's narrative teaches that leadership cannot rely on fear alone, that power is inseparable from perception, and that systems have mechanisms to correct imbalance. His rise, reign, and fall illustrate the interplay of individual agency and collective necessity. The underworld learned from him, adapted, and endured, just as history has preserved his story as both a legend and a cautionary guide. His life is a reminder that influence achieved through terror is temporary, but understanding, patience, and strategy can shape enduring authority. In the final reflection on Albert Anastasia's life, it becomes clear that his story is as much about the nature of power as it is about a single individual. From the streets of Calabria to the docks of Brooklyn, from enforcer to boss, his trajectory illustrates the rise and fall of a man who built authority on fear, decisive action, and relentless brutality. Yet his ultimate demise demonstrates that even the most feared figures exist within a network of forces larger than themselves, and that power is never absolute. The lessons of his life linger quietly, not only in history books, but in the structure, strategy, and psychology of organized crime itself. Anastasia's life was defined by contrasts. In his youth, he experienced deprivation, instability, and the normalization of violence. These circumstances instilled survival instincts that would later define his approach to power. When he arrived in America, these instincts were tested and honed on the crowded streets of Brooklyn, where competition, corruption, and danger intersected. Early acts of violence were both practical and symbolic, signaling his ability to navigate a world where strength dictated survival. Over time, these qualities elevated him from street enforcer to one of the most feared men in the criminal underworld. Yet, as with many who wield power through fear, the very traits that secured his rise also sowed the seeds of his vulnerability. Anastasia's volatility, impatience, and reliance on intimidation alienated potential allies and attracted careful observation from rivals. While his enforcement skills and reputation for ruthlessness commanded immediate respect, they also created enemies who were willing to wait, plan, and act collectively. Fear, while powerful, could unify those around him in ways that eventually undermined his authority. In this sense, Anastasia's life illustrates a fundamental principle of power: it may be effective in the short term, but unchecked aggression and unpredictability invite eventual correction. The concept of inevitability is central to understanding Anastasia's fall. His death was not a spontaneous act of revenge, it was the result of careful planning by the Commission, the governing body of American organized crime. Leaders who valued stability, discretion, and long-term strategy recognized that Anastasia's volatility threatened the broader system. His removal was deliberate, coordinated, and executed in a manner that minimized disruption. The silent consensus among his peers highlights a critical lesson: true power often resides not in intimidation or force, but in the ability to navigate networks, influence outcomes indirectly, and align collective action with strategic objectives. Anastasia's assassination in the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel remains iconic not only for its violence, but for its symbolism. A man who had commanded fear across an entire criminal empire met his end in a routine, seemingly mundane setting. The location underscored a poignant truth: power is contingent on context, and no individual, no matter how feared, is beyond the reach of coordinated opposition. The quiet efficiency of his removal demonstrated that careful planning and patience often trump brute force and volatility. In reflecting on his life, it becomes apparent that Anastasia's legacy is double-edged. On one hand, he represents the extreme efficacy of fear as a tool for control, and the ability of one man to influence a vast and complex network through presence, reputation, and decisive action. His career illustrates how calculated violence can enforce obedience, achieve objectives, and maintain authority across both vertical hierarchies and informal networks. On the other hand, his story serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of such power. The same reliance on intimidation that enabled his dominance also fostered isolation, distrust, and vulnerability, ultimately leaving him exposed to the collective judgment of his peers. Moreover, Anastasia's life offers insight into the interplay between myth and reality. Public perception, media accounts, and later retellings have often amplified his actions, casting him as a larger-than-life figure whose name evokes terror and fascination. Yet the reality, though equally dramatic, is more nuanced. He was a man shaped by circumstance, opportunity, and environment. His decisions were informed by a complex interplay of instinct, necessity, and personal temperament. Separating myth from fact reveals a figure whose authority rested on both strategic understanding and instinctive application of violence, a combination that is rare, but not invincible. The transformation of organized crime following his death further illustrates the lessons embedded in his story. Figures like Carlo Gambino, who succeeded him, demonstrated the power of restraint, subtlety, and strategic patience. Where Anastasia relied on immediate displays of force, his successors emphasized discretion, calculated influence, and the careful management of perception. The underworld learned from his rise and fall, adapting structures to ensure long-term stability, reduce unnecessary exposure, and maintain authority without overt reliance on fear. In this sense, Anastasia's life influenced not only his contemporaries, but the evolution of organized crime itself. Psychologically, his narrative underscores the cost of power wielded through fear. Isolation, paranoia, and constant vigilance defined his daily life, even amid luxury and wealth. Relationships were conditioned by mistrust. Loyalty was dictated by necessity rather than genuine allegiance. While others may have envied his influence, the personal toll of maintaining dominance through terror was significant. Anastasia's experiences highlight a broader principle applicable in many contexts: the exercise of authority without trust or collaboration creates instability, stress, and eventual vulnerability. Anastasia's story also emphasizes the importance of networks and collective oversight in systems of power. While individually formidable, his authority was ultimately contingent upon the acceptance, or at least acquiescence, of his peers. The Commission's silent sanctioning of his removal demonstrates that no individual exists outside the constraints of the system in which they operate. Even the most violent, feared, or charismatic figures are subject to the checks imposed by structure, consensus, and strategic coordination. His life, therefore, serves as a lesson in both the potential and the limits of personal dominance within organized systems. In considering his broader legacy, one must also reflect on the enduring cultural fascination with Anastasia. His life is a prism through which we explore themes of power, fear, loyalty, and inevitability. From journalists to historians, from filmmakers to scholars, his story continues to resonate precisely because it embodies universal truths about human behavior and organizational dynamics. The Mad Hatter represents the extreme consequences of leadership conducted through violence and unpredictability, offering insights that extend far beyond the underworld. Ultimately, Albert Anastasia's life and death converge into a meditation on impermanence, authority, and consequence. He achieved a level of influence few could match, commanding fear, respect, and obedience across an entire city. Yet that very mastery could not protect him from the patient, coordinated, and deliberate forces of his peers. The lessons of his story are clear: power achieved through terror is fragile, authority must be balanced with strategy, loyalty, and discretion, and even the most formidable figures are ultimately subject to forces larger than themselves. In the quiet aftermath, when the streets of New York returned to their rhythms, Anastasia's name became both legend and lesson. His life embodies the extremes of influence, its capacity to command immediate obedience and inspire myth, as well as its vulnerability to patient opposition and systemic correction. The echoes of his story continue to inform understanding of leadership, strategy, and human behavior, leaving a legacy that is at once cautionary, instructive, and indelibly compelling. Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter, the Lord High Executioner, is no longer a man who walks the streets of Brooklyn or commands obedience through fear. Yet his story persists in memory, in history, and in the structures that followed. In the stillness after his life, the lessons remain clear: fear may command attention, violence may secure compliance, but only foresight, patience, and collective wisdom endure. His death was the final chapter, but the resonance of his life continues, a reminder that even the most powerful men eventually return to silence, leaving only story, consequence, and memory.